And the Japanese architect, is so happy. He says, "You have said something to me you've never said to anyone else. Right. How wonderful. You do love me." And I think
the artist just sees that as just so much material. You know, I think later when you have Alma offering her arm and you have that awful
that's in the dream. That's
I know
part
it
of
is,
the dream.
But you see, I think that sequence that you refer to as Alma's dream is Bergman, okay, I can't get anywhere with realism in establishing some sort of interface between these two characters who are no longer really characters in the old-fashioned sense of character. Yeah. And there's something happening between them, and I can't show you what's happening to them in terms of dramatic incidents, but I can begin to create these strange incidents between them that have a kind of symbolic value. There is a sense in which the artist is a cannibal. In the Kakutani interview after Fanny and Alexander in the New York Times was wonderful, where Bergman, one of his friends is talking about the way that Bergman, if you call him up, he wants to know everything that's wrong with your life. And the worst thing you can think of that's happened to you recently, and he just, there's a kind of desire to assimilate whatever terrible experience even your good friends have, because you can do something with it in your films.
Although he's so reticent about talking about, except in that one book, to my mind, the
Bergman?
The Bergman on Bergman.
Yeah.
That is the one place where he actually talks about his own experiences, comments on the film, but always when it comes to symbolic interpretation as well. Oh. That's up to other people.
Okay. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to leave these symbolic interpretations up to other people, our audience, and if they want to screen this for themselves sometime or find books on Bergman. If you're interested in cinema then, cinema now, or in film studies, graduate or undergraduate, at the College of Staten Island, drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that address again, okay? That's Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, this 30 minutes went by extremely fast. I want to thank you, Dennis, for joining us. Always a pleasure to have a CUNY colleague on the show. Linda, thanks for coming down from the Berkshires to join us with your expertise on Bergman.
It was a pleasure.
Oh, it was a pleasure having you here. Well, I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thank you for joining us. Well.
This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today, we see the fifth and last installment in our mini-series, Expressionism in Film. We'll be seeing Ingmar Bergman's 1966 production, Persona. Persona is frequently cited as one of the 10 greatest films ever made. It's also the center of a great deal of critical attention and, in fact, interpretive warfare. We'll have two guests with us after the film, Professor Dennis Denito of City College of the City University of New York, and Professor Linda Bunsen of Williams College, to try to sort out a lot of this for us. In the meantime, enjoy Bergman's intriguing Persona.
Oh, I should know. When he'd been talking how big this raccoon was, and had to be enormous. It looked like a very modest raccoon.
Welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I'm sure you are at the very least intrigued, I suspect moved, by Persona. Among the many films we've had on this series, I think you've seen one now in which is definitely called for that we have some discussion of this film. We have two Bergman specialists with us today, and I'd like to take this moment to introduce them both to you. On my left is Professor Linda Bunsen. Linda's professor of English at Williams College in Massachusetts. Linda's the author of a critical study of Sylvia Plath, Plath's Incarnations, Woman, and the Creative Process. In addition to that, she's written a number of articles on Ingmar Bergman, taught several courses on Bergman's films. At the moment, she's writing a book on Adrian Rich and is using her sabbatical year to churn out a number of film articles as well, notably on Aliens and on Blue Velvet. To my right, I have the pleasure of having my CUNY colleague, Professor Dennis Denito, with us today. Dennis is a professor of cinema at City College of the City University of New York. He's known for as the author of a significant textbook about the cinema, film, form, and feeling. Most recently, he's been working on a Bergman essay on Bergman's works for the Encyclopedia World Film Directors. In addition, an ongoing project for him is a study of film movements in Western culture. Well, Dennis, since we've got you and got the camera on you and that sort of thing, I'd just like to start. This film, there's a lot to talk about in this film, about the film itself. But I'd like to start, if we may, by locating this film somewhat in Bergman's career. Where does Bergman begin, and where in his career does this film take place?
Well, to summarize Bergman, and even to think of him in terms of stages, one could see from his very earliest films, to perhaps Smiles of a Summer Night, was his apprenticeship period. And that ranged into the late 40s, early 50s.
Right.
And then with The Seventh Seal, and films that lasted into the mid-60s, he was particularly preoccupied with what he called the God question.
Right.
And you have the trilogy, and you have the Virgin Spring and others. Persona begins a new stage, a stage in which he is particularly preoccupied with the female psyche, with the woman, and an independence on the part of the woman, a finding of her own individuality, whereas the women before had less of that quality. So that we are in 1966 with a new approach, the breaking down of some of the barriers to technical approaches to filmmaking, and Bergman reaches to my mind, a type of pinnacle in persona.
I want to ask Linda a question in a second, but there is, you just brought up something intriguing. This is it's a chamber film in so many ways, yet we might, and this is something I think we can come back to and talk about fruitfully, it's also a high-tech chamber film, and it draws on a whole set of resources, I think, in the cinema that hadn't really been available. I mean, that things are used for aesthetic end, but they could only be used in that way after they've been invented or they're used in such capable hands as someone like Sven Nykvist, the cinematographer. Perhaps we can come back to talk about that.
Fine.
But what I'd like to do is talk about the specific genesis of this film, because there's a story behind how this film came about. And could I nudge that story out of you? Yeah.
Well, I think Bergman in many interviews has talked about his situation when he made Persona. At the time, he did not believe he would ever make a film again. He had been seriously ill in a hospital. He had postponed the making of film, which in script form was called The Cannibals. It later turned into Hour of the Wolf. And he talks about these terrible dizzy spells from antibiotic poisoning, which explains, at least in the opening montage of Persona, the way in which images are sometimes inverted and you find yourself very disoriented and trying continually to establish a relationship with the film frame. And he also talks about the view from his room where he saw bodies moving in and out of what presumably was the hospital morgue. And in the opening montage of Persona, at the beginning, you, as a viewer, are saying, where am I? This looks very much like dead bodies, and you have that jump cut of the eyes open, eyes shut, and then the small boy who is a character who gradually comes alive. He also talks about Bibi Andersson and Liv Ullmann and the genesis of the shattering sequence later and the similarity he noticed between the two faces. But kinematography, meaning film, was the original title, and Persona became a comeback film for Bergman.
Yeah, that's well, but I think Persona is a great title for the for the film.
It's significant that Bergman was reading Jung at that time. It's Jung that popularized the term. It had been in psychoanalysis before, but Jung made it part of the vocabulary of depth psychology. The persona as the mask, the Eliot line, the mask to meet the masks. And we start out with people who are wearing masks, although Elizabeth from the beginning seems to me to have gone to the next stage of moving away from her mask. But Alma comes on at the very beginning as a healthy, sure young lady who, as she kneels in bed, says, I know who I am, I know where I'm going.
Well, except that that soliloquy is very interesting because she is applying a mask when she delivers it. She is rubbing that cold cream on.
But that disappears.
And but then what she says at the very end of the soliloquy as she puts the cold cream down is, I wonder what's bothering Elizabeth Persona, or Elizabeth Fogler. And it's as though the character of Elizabeth Fogler has made her self-conscious about who she is, you know, because she, before that, presumably has been unthinking and not someone who examines her feelings, her attitudes, her relationships, but goes on, as she says, any old way, because that's the easiest way to live.
And this experience is the crucial experience that leads her into herself, which is the basic pattern of the film.
But she doesn't know if there's a self to be found. You know, later on when she reads the letter and she goes to that pool, she sees her mirror image in the pool, but it's a very shadowy figure that she looks at. And I think at that moment she is wondering, you know, whether there is a Alma, whether there is a real person. And I think it's also a moment when Bergman is asking whether his two personae have an integrity of being.
You know, you've just brought up, I think, a very interesting feature of the film, and the key word, one of the key word you're using, Dennis, is pattern. It's interesting you would use the word pattern instead of the word we more commonly use for, you know, the kinds of movies we go to movie houses to see, and that's how Persona was distributed, plotted. That is, this film has a dramatic line to it, but it's a dramatic line that is, you might say, molested in a whole set of ways. I mean, you can't turn this into a normal plotted film in a set of ways.
Now, Bergman quite frequently has this dual quality. I think for me, the pattern that appears so often is the journey. And I see a parallel between Wild Strawberries and Persona. That is, in Wild Strawberries, a man goes on a physical journey from one city to another, but he is going on a journey into the interior. And this is what I feel is happening in Persona. There is a physical movement from the hospital to the seashore, but the actual events are that exploration into the self, just the way you find in so many of his films. People are entering into self. What I find interesting is the question of how any filmmaker is to portray what happens on the inner journey. Yeah. Whether it's an Antonioni or Godard, or how do you present this in a medium that's basically realistic?
Yeah.
I disagree.
That's a good start.
That's a good start. That's good. That's why we're the liveliest discussion.
I do not think that I think that you're right about Wild Strawberries, and what's interesting about Wild Strawberries is the way in which Bergman gives you a character in the present, and then the journey unfolds for you, the psychological past, everything that happened to this old man, Isak Borg. But the thing about Persona is Bergman, I think, as an artist, whether there is such an entity as a person to be created, and whether there is in life a person to be imitated in art. Because if you look at the way those characters are created initially, your perception of them is as polar opposites. But by the end of the film, you say, wait a minute, who is Elisabeth and who is Alma? They're asking that question. You and the audience are asking that question. Many viewers say they must be two halves of the same person. You end up with falling into the abyss of, I think, characterization on the artistic level and into personhood in terms of your own reality.
You know,
it becomes a real, you know, the interior journey becomes a bottomless pit.
If I may negotiate on these matters between the two positions, I don't think they're irreconcilable. But no. In a recent interview, Milan Kundera has been talking about what's going on in the novel today, and how he talks about how he doesn't write psychological novels because, whether this is true or not, the reasoning, you know, after Joyce and what Joyce did with his microscope, he could go inside his characters as if with a microscope. The thing that you find is you find the limits of psychological explanation, because you come up that everyone is made up of those same tiny component parts that under the microscope are indistinguishable from one another. And I guess the way I'm negotiating between the two of you is that I think we begin Persona with the set of expectations we bring to Wild Strawberries. And it's not as if they're irrelevant, it's just that we keep passing further and further on.
No, and you pass beyond the psychiatrist too.
Well, when you come to that, you speak almost as if we're dealing with, and you are denying it, a sort of bottom line. After you've seen the film, some of Bergman's films end with a sort of conclusion, such as Wild Strawberries, ending with the smile, and even though he has to readjust to everybody, and very few people are adjusting to him, and you might at the end of The Seventh Seal, Mia and Yov go into the sunset, so to speak. But this film does not end on that note of a conclusion.
The film falls off the sprockets. Yeah.
Part of it, because you're right in this respect, that he is constantly bringing up the question of what the medium. He is breaking down the view that particularly since the very beginning of film, that you created a illusion on the screen in which the audience identified, entered into that illusion. And that was a self-sufficient entity, just as you had in the theater, until Brecht came along with Alienation. And he's breaking that down from the very beginning, from the very opening, what he called the poetic images, what I think of more as an overture, the themes that are going to be expressed later in the film. But he is, I still feel he is trying to go on that journey into Alma. Very little into Elizabeth, but goes into Alma. And we start at the beginning with the question of where does realism end and where do we have something that isn't realistic? What do you think at the very beginning of the film there's something
I think at
of
the
that?
very beginning you get something very unrealistic with Alma's entrance into the psychiatrist's room, because it's actually this wonderful line that suddenly becomes a door, and in walks a character who is dressed in a nurse's uniform. And you have this very blank kind of set. And I think of it as being extremely modern and as being very abstract in the way it introduces characters. But Bergman already, you get intercut those scenes of Elizabeth on stage when she laughs and in the heavy persona makeup. But there's a wonderful moment right there where he switches the close-up so that he's already visually playing with the idea that Alma can play Elizabeth and Elizabeth can play Alma, that visually as a director he can already begin to manipulate his personae. But one thing I want to say about that interior journey, you're absolutely right. I mean, Bergman has, before Persona, his major idea as a filmmaker was always to create these wonderful characters and to do it with a kind of psychological depth that is fairly rare, I think, in a 90-minute film. But the first moment you're alone with Elizabeth Fogler, and if you've been a Bergman aficionado, you say, I am going to at last find out what's wrong with Elizabeth Fogler. I'm going to get a close-up, and she's going to, in some way, reveal to me what's going on. The psychiatrist doesn't know, Alma doesn't know, but I'll know, because Bergman will make her available to me. And what he does in that sequence is he plays Bach, and he has asynchronicity, because the Bach is playing, but the sun sets like zap. I mean, it's,
It's twilight.
well, but it falls very quickly while the music continues to play. And all you get from Elizabeth Fogler is her staring at the screen, and then she sighs and covers her face. And you don't really get that privileged information that Bergman has always supplied. And I remember the first time I saw the film, I said, wait a minute, Bergman, you were supposed to do this for me, and he wouldn't do it.
I don't think with Elizabeth he ever does. I don't think
No,
we ever
I don't.
understand why. We have certain hints. The reaction to the burning of the Buddhist monk, the famous photograph from the ghetto that was used in Night and Fog. There is a world out there of violence that frightens her, and which she withdraws from in one respect, and also hides from things around her. But why she is actually doing this, I don't think is ever explained, because I think Alma is our subject. Alma is the person we're going to come to terms with. Alma is going to satisfy your curiosity, your need to get deeper, although there is no answer. There can be no answer.
No.
No human being
but I
can be
think
answered.
that Elizabeth Fogler is and the way Liv Ullmann and Bergman both talk about her, she is, just as Albert Emanuel Fogler in The Magician is Bergman, that she and his silence is, precedes Elizabeth's silence, that there's a relationship between Bergman and that character. I mean, I think it's interesting. You're going at the character in terms of the exploration of Alma, while I'm going at it in terms of Bergman exploring himself as an artist figure. And Elisabeth Vogler is his alter ego in the film, while Alma is the character that Bergman has always
I'm always
tried
a
to
little,
create.
a little frightened of going too far in
Oh.
relating the director. Being brought up in a critical period of the 50s and 40s when we thought of the work of art as an entity unto itself, I tend to keep going in that direction, which is to say, here's a film, and it is by Bergman, and it's self-reflective in so many ways. You see connections all over the place with films that came before or after, thinking, it seems to me almost ironic that, perhaps purposefully so, that you have Alma, B.B. Anderson, and you have Elizabeth as Liv Ullmann. Then, in the next film, Hour of the Wolf, Liv Ullmann is named Alma, so that you have the, she's assumed the role of B.B. Anderson, name, just the name. Also in the Hour of the Wolf, you have a Vogler, you have Veronica Vogler.
Yeah.
And the use
But
of
one of the things that people talk about in the Bergman world is that there's this incredible recurrence of motifs, and which they're what I think one critic in different contexts is called floating motifs. I mean, they're constant in that they keep popping up, but what their valence is, what their meaning is constantly shifting in a lot of ways.
I think that, you know, in Fanny and Alexander, his farewell to filmmaking, that Emily, the mother, is a resurrection of Elisabeth Vogler, that she leaves the stage in search of truth in some of the same ways that you see Elisabeth Vogler trying to avoid the falsity of the theater, of wearing a mask, of being untrue. And he does. He keeps going back.
But we were talking about two different. You two are talking about two different things. I mean, you're talking to one another about them. I mean, one of the things you're talking about is the world created by Bergman throughout the canon of his work, and one can talk about that very fruitfully. I mean, the other thing to talk about is this film and how it itself works very specifically as.
That's my particular interest.
Yeah. Well, then I'll want to continue with that.
All right. What I think of in terms, well, there is one way of starting, is to say, what is the physical reality we know? We go to the seashore. There is a relationship built up between the two women, particularly Alma's confessional. There is the reading of the letter. There is a disruption of that relationship. Now, to me, and you may disagree with this, to me, the most important moment then comes when Alma lies down. She lies down in bed. She has the radio on the side. She is dressed in this pajama up to the, over here. She rests. She has an agitated reaction. We see the reverse face. And then we go into a series of events, including the showing of the two women, the exchange with the husband, and a series of other things. Then we come back to Alma lying in bed in the same pajamas. The radio, which we had seen on the bed, is right back where it was at the beginning. To my mind, that is all her fantasy. That is all an inner world, which would explain a problem that so many critics have brought up. How, when they were talking together, did she know what Elizabeth went through with the child? At the party and so on. Now, I have a sense, I can see a rising of the left eyebrow, that you disagree with that.
Well, I don't think I disagree with that. I think that most critics do talk about the way the film, it seems to have a kind of narrative coherency up till that point. And then you have a series of seemingly tentative sketches that are far from tentative, I think, in their realization, because they're dramatically so powerful. But what happens for me when you get to that part of the film is that it you can do a kind of infinite regress because there are questions about earlier sequences that have no answers either. For example, who turns off the television when Elizabeth Vogler is watching the burning Bonzi? Who turned it off, and why, if this is Sweden, do we have an English announcer telling us the kill ratios? So that I think that's the screen is always bleaching out. There's something very unrealistic about Alma sitting up in bed and delivering what I take to be a dramatic soliloquy. It's no different than what Shakespearean characters do, but there is a falsity to it, and a falsity to the earlier sequences that finally comes to the fore in those later sequences, which seem to have more of a symbolic.
But the difference, that's what's. See, I take it that what we try to do initially in the film is to naturalize things. That is,
we try to believe in the reality of those characters.
Absolutely, I think that's
what Bergman says no.
No, well, but we're trying to do that until this certain point, what Dennis is talking about, and then it's not a free for all. I mean, that's the wrong word. But what happens is that possibility of a so-called realistic interpretation, one that says this is happening, in a nice suburban neighborhood or whatever, is nixed. And because it's nixed at that point, we retrospectively have to go back and pick up all those things about the other scenes that we tried to naturalize.
I think if we consider, let's say, realism and the breakdown of realism, kind of expressionism.
Right.
That.
Glad we're going to get to that.
Got to get that in. Right. From the very beginning of the film, we are getting intimations. There is the sense, Bergman purposefully, I think, for example, the room, or the voice of the doctor when Alma first appears is in this almost echo chamber. There is unrealistic qualities, but the realism is predominant. And as you progress...
Because we want it to be realistic. I think we're so thankful that what did I miss?
Something to hold on to. Something to hold on to.
All of a sudden, a character comes out, and a Bergman character, which has always been something you can hang on to. Not that you'd always want to hang on to a Bergman character, because they're frequently psychologically a bag of neuroses and psychoses and other problems, but at least, there's something to hang on to. And then Bergman sort of gradually, I think he slips the rug out from under you in the same way that he felt that the rug had been slipped out from him. I think the moment for me, the moment for you is the beginning of the dream, but the moment for me is the visitation at night, when you have, once again, that patterning, which is you're right, it's an expressionistic kind of patterning where you watch Alma come to her bed, get up, go to the bathroom, come back to bed. Elizabeth comes in.
Does she come in?
Does she come in? But I think for me, what happens there, you have two women who, up till that point, have seemed to be totally distinct dramatis personae. They look into the camera, they establish eye contact, and their faces cross. And for me, this is the moment when Bergman presents a question both to himself and to the audience. He's saying, maybe they're not so different. Maybe I can, from this moment on, see what happens if the interface between two characters.
Already. We had it.
Yes.
We had it with the white hat and the dark hat, and then that shot of Alma at the table drinking the coffee, where she leans forward. She leans forward, and then you see the bottom from the neck down of Elizabeth, and it's almost as if Alma is taking the place of her head.
And that's when she's also talking about a terrible intimacy with that man who she says, I never thought I was real. She's talking about smoking and about how she smoked once before when she was dating that man, but in that love affair she never felt quite real. And that is, again, the kind of experience Alma will undergo with Elizabeth.
Yeah, but also Alma is slowly, progressively offering more and more to Elizabeth, to the climactic moment in that would be this wonderful monologue of the experience on the beach with the two boys, which later she points out she had never told anyone. And this is
But even
this
Bergman
is love,
even there
the love
suggests.
gift.
But Bergman even there suggests that even when we think we're being most intimate and offering most of ourselves to others, we're also play acting, because she
She says that, like-
punctuates that whole soliloquy with all these little dramatic gestures, and she gets up onto, it looks like a stage, for the final sort of farewell as she's telling the
She
whole
said it
story.
was exhibition. She later tells when she's on the beach with Elizabeth, she says it was a lot of exhibitionism. But it is that how, no matter what the degree of her play acting, I think she meant this as the love offering to Elizabeth. She's saying, I'm telling to you that I would never tell anyone else. That's how much I believe in you. It's the sort of thing that happened in Hiroshima Mon Amour when they're in the cafe, and the Japanese architect is so happy. He says, you have said something to me you've never said to anyone else. How wonderful. You do love me. And I think
Well, the
that's
artist just sees that as just so much material. You know, I think later when you have Alma offering her arm and you have that awful
that's in the
bloodletting.
dream. That's
I know
part
it
of
is,
the dream.
but you see, I think that sequence that you refer to as Alma's dream is Bergman, okay, I can't get anywhere with realism in establishing some sort of interface between these two characters who are no longer really characters in the old-fashioned sense of character, and there's something happening between them, and I can't show you what's happening to them in terms of dramatic incidents, but I can begin to create these strange incidents between them that have a kind of symbolic value. There is a sense in which the artist is a cannibal. In the Kakutani interview after Fanny and Alexander in the New York Times was wonderful, where Bergman, one of his friends is talking about the way that Bergman, if you call him up, he wants to know everything that's wrong with your life. And the worst thing you can think of that's happened to you recently, and he just, there's a kind of desire to assimilate whatever terrible experience even your good friends have, because you can do something with it in your films.
Although he's so reticent about
Well,
talking about, except in that one book, to my mind, the
Björkman?
the Bergman on
Sima,
Bergman.
yeah.
That is the
Björkman,
one
Sima,
place where he actually
Mons.
talks about his own experiences, comments on the film, but always when it comes to symbolic interpretation as well.
Oh.
That's up to other people.
Okay, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to leave these symbolic interpretations up to other people, our audience, and if they want to screen this for themselves sometime or find books on Bergman. If you're interested in cinema then, cinema now, or in film studies, graduate or undergraduate, at the College of Staten Island, drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that address again, okay? That's Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today, we see our third installment in our mini-series, Expressionism in Film. We'll be seeing the 1931 production, Fritz Lang's M. This film is famous for its use of sound. It's an early sound film, but really extraordinary technically, and it's also the film that catapulted Peter Lorre to international fame as a psychopathic killer. We'll be talking about those subjects and others after the film with today's two guests, Professor Miriam Hansen of Rutgers University and Dr. John Belton, a film critic and scholar. Enjoy M. regret about that, Miriam. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed M, a terrifying film in many ways, a fascinating film in a number of ways. We have, as we traditionally do, two guests today, and I'd like to take this moment to introduce them both to you. Sitting to my left is Professor Miriam Hansen. Miriam teaches film and literature at Rutgers University through their Department of English. She's an expert on modernism in the arts and is the author of Ezra Pound, Early Poetics Between Enlightenment and the Avant-Garde. Her interests have always been strongly in film as well, and she's the author of a forthcoming book on spectatorship in the American silent film that's called, and I like the title, Babel and Babylon. In addition, she's an editor of the periodical, the New German Critique. To my right is Dr. John Belton, who has taught at Columbia, Harvard, Yale, and Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. John has authored a number of articles and several books. I'd like to mention that he's one of the co-editors in an important anthology called Film Sound, which is the first anthology to really cover this issue of sound in film. At the moment, he's lucky enough to have a National Endowment for Humanities grant and is working on a history of CinemaScope for that. Well, this is not a CinemaScope film, John.
No, it's not.
No, but but you don't have to be CinemaScope to be interesting, and particularly visually interesting. Before we came on camera, we were chatting about some of the some questions like, how expressionist is this film, and how does it fit in with the kind of categorization of what constitutes expressionist film, and how does this fit in or not, and how? And
the whole notion of what an expressionist film is an extremely thorny issue. In the past, I know you've shown films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, films which have sort of been included in what's called the canon of expressionist films. M is a problematic film in terms of that traditional canon. Superficially, one could say that M is in some ways realistic. By that I mean there are obvious uses of location in the film. The whole police procedure that we see documented in the film is something like a documentary.
Right. Yes.
And Lang himself has based the film on an actual historical event. He hired dozens and dozens of criminals to play criminals in the film, and reports have it that there were 24 arrests during the shooting of the film on the set of these criminals. So on the one hand, there's an atmosphere in the film that is tremendously immediate and loosely termed realistic. Yet at the center of the film is a psychopathic killer whose ancestry comes from films like Nosferatu,
right?
Who in many ways represents the kind of mental anguish that's traditionally associated with the style of expressionism. This figure, in fact, is largely introduced in terms of expressionistic devices, in terms of a shadow which is projected on a poster advertising a reward for his capture or information leading to his capture. He's introduced largely as a silent character, which again looks back to the silence of expressionist cinema.
But his speech at the end also spells out the assumption of the expressionist psychopath, the doppelganger, when he talks about how he walks through the streets and somebody's following him, and it's his own shadow, it's his own manic self. I think you could also make a case for M as an expressionist film in terms of the visual style, the kinds of lighting technique that are usually associated with expressionism. You mentioned the use of shadows, the whole chiaroscuro lighting technique, contrast of light and dark, the use of extreme angles, as with the tall man stopping the short man in the street, intimidating him. And the whole way composition an abstraction of figures is used to emphasize the narrative points. For instance, the way the circle is used, the motif of the circle. From the beginning, the murder and the murderer is associated with figures of circles, like the children in the courtyard. The first time we see Beckert step into the frame is when Elsie plays with a ball, and Laurie's head, the shadow of his head, is like a circle, falling exactly on the word murderer. And in fact, when we first see Laurie from the front, when we first see his face, he's framed by pineapples and oranges.
Yeah.
Until at the very end, again, this motif is spelled out in terms of his neuroses, that he goes in a circle. He keeps running away from himself, and the only time he can forget is by committing another murder.
Yeah.
And it's that spiral, you know, that you also see in the
One
love
could
story.
counter, I think, by saying that one way of talking about expressionism is to talk about it in terms of a certain kind of subjectivity that is located within the psychology of a central character. And according to this definition, one would say that the space of the film is in some ways an extension of that character's perceptions. And with the kind of space you're talking about, I would say is imposed upon the characters. In other words, this is not a film in which the drama grows out of the characters and extends to the space around them. The characters are always seen as fixtures within the space, as again in the many overhead shots, which align the characters with some sort of feature of the overall composition, so that their humanity is quite often subsumed into a larger sense of architectural design.
Yeah.
And this is what moves the film away from expressionism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would certainly agree with you on that. It's a much more objective space than you have in Nosferatu or Caligari.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And that's maybe why the whole expressionism-realism dichotomy is not really that productive for the film.
Well, let me focus just for a second on the question of a very, very rich question in this film, the relationship between the visuals and the soundtrack. Because one of the things I think for someone who's first seeing this film is that this is a film that was made in 1931, and I think the use of image and sound is as fresh to us today as it was at that time, and it's complicated. It's not, you know, we do have the extended dialogue sequences of people talking with one another, but we have cutting back and forth among scenes, which is unusual. But how might this whole issue of the relationship of the visual image to sound fold into this expressionist thing? I mean, either of you. I mean, I'm not. I was looking at John, but that doesn't mean I.
To a certain extent, the coming of sound is seen as a kind of terminus point for traditional expressionism, which I would loosely define as a process by which something can be expressed which cannot normally be expressed, something invisible, something spiritual, something transcendent. What sound brings in certain bodies of cinema is a realization of space. And traditional expressionist space is highly plastic, highly malleable, unrealistic. Now Lang is playing, again, this is his first sound film. The relationship between sound and image is not always one that is there to realize the space.
Right.
There's one instance I can think of the police inspector is reviewing the facts in his office, and we see images that might be documenting the evidence he's acquired in the case. He's speaking in one space, the images are referring to another space, so the space is kind of still quasi-unrealistic.
It's even used as a counterpoint when the inspector tries to blackmail one of the gangsters that they caught with murder charges, and he says, "The night watchman," and you see a shot of the night watchman, the guard, feasting away at dinner. And on the soundtrack and in that other space, the inspector tries to create the expression that he's dead. So you actually have an example of contrapuntal sound there.
Actually, the sound has been described as a kind of montage in relationship to the image, a vertical montage, if you will, that the sound is always doing something different than we see on the image track. But more often than not, I think the sound has the function of achieving a kind of continuity. The film is made up of a whole different series of spaces, characters, and events, and the soundtrack is constantly stitching them together.
Right.
In one sequence, we see a newsboy advertising the headline, "Where is the murderer?" And he repeats this again and again. The next shot is, I think the first shot we see of Peter Lorre in the film with his back to the camera, scribbling a note to the press. The question, "Where is the murderer?" has been answered. He's been identified for us visually. And of course, the marvelous sequence in which the police and the underworld debate what they should do about this problem of the murder, the problem that the murderer has created for them. It culminates in a series of continuities. One of the groups of people will say, "I wanted to ask you here," and then we cut to another group to say, "For your advice," as if there were no bridge at all between the different parties.
But those bridges are also made on the image track, like a movement. A gangster will start opening the discussion like this, and the movement will be continued by a figure in the police, in the meeting of the police headquarters, or somebody will get up. A gangster will get up, and in the next shot you see a police member of the police department get up. And this parallelism is also enforced in terms of the mood, when they're not finding a solution.
Yeah, the criminal's not finding it, and they're frustrated. The authorities are not finding it.
Upswing again.
Yeah.
And they're developing some kind of strategy. But I would like to come back to the question of sound, and whether that's used in an expressionist manner or in a montage manner. And I think it's important what you pointed out about the sound operating in kind of layers, a vertical montage, which always helps us to keep the soundtrack and the image track apart. We're always aware of them as two separate discourses, which I think could lead one to make an argument for this film as a Brechtian film in the context of Brechtian cinema as we have it in the 60s and 70s in Godard, but even more specifically in that historical context, 1931, Brecht was a relatively well-known playwright in Germany at the time. The Threepenny Opera was rather famous, rather popular, and it's not just that Lang took a specific motif from the Threepenny Opera, namely the Beggars' Organization, but I think there are a lot of ways in which concepts of Brechtian cinema, concepts of characters as types, concepts of acting as quoting, concepts of montage that are characteristic of Brechtian epic cinema.
Let me just bring up one example. I mean, perhaps the most famous and memorable example from the film, and that's, of course, the famous excerpt from the Grieg, which is then whistled. Well, I mean, that is a quotation from a famous piece of music that keeps coming up again and again in the film. And while it becomes associated with the murderer, it is this fragment that, while it identifies the murderer, has different valence for different people at different times. And it's certainly, you know, a quotation from a very famous work that gets distributed through the work in different ways and takes on all kinds of powers, because we're interested in that fragment of music according to who's humming it or who's listening for the humming of it. So it is this, just to come back, this fragmentation, this distribution of something from a larger work, taking that fragment and then redeploying it through a work so it's seen in so many, many different ways.
And I think that also plays into the whole question of the parallelism that's established in that famous sequence you're describing between the investigation of the police on the one hand and the gangsters' investigation on the other. Namely that what Lang gives us here is an anatomy of an investigation. He doesn't give us a story to to identify with. We do not identify with Elsie's mother. We don't stay with her crying. We don't even see the body. We don't identify with anybody because nobody has a leg to stand on. What Lang does is he introduces a case, the case of a child murderer, into a social mechanism. And then he lets every group perform in a crisis in the way that is typical for that group.
I would see it slightly differently, and that is that, again, like Brecht, there's immediate identification with certain kinds of performers that takes place through a certain distancing devices, so that rather than say we do not identify with the mothers or with the police or with the underworld, I would say we assume identification with them successively. And I think there's a kind of diabolical strategy taking place in the film that has to do with its against its narrative structure and its repression of a certain kind of identification. That is, with M, with Beckert, with Peter Lorre. We first experience, you might say, this event, this anatomy of an event, through the eyes of a mother whose child is absent. Then we experience the event through the larger paranoia of accusations throughout the city, which finally extends itself in a kind of rippling effect to the bureaucracies of the police and the underworld. And we get to see from different angles, you might say, the ramifications of what this psychopathic killer has done. But Lang holds off identification with M, with the psychopathic killer, until the very last sequence, in which suddenly we begin to see something of his point of view. And there's not any member of the audience, I think, that doesn't have a moment of sympathy with this poor character, because now he is in the position that a victim that has been occupied by others throughout the film.
Already earlier, in fact.
He's been off screen.
In the attic, when he's hounded in the attic, you can see him, you really put in the corner in the attic with him when they're searching the building.
And of course, there's the very famous shot. You happen to have a script version of it with you when we were chatting earlier, and it's on the cover of the published script, and that is the moment in which he sees the M on the back. And he sees it mirrored, and it's such an interesting moment because the entire film we've been on the side of whoever it is who's been tracking this person down, and yet the moment in which he discovers that he's this marked person in some way is chilling. It's utterly chilling, but for it to be chilling, you must have assumed his point of view of discovering that he's being tracked by someone. And so there is that reversal that you said, well, wait a minute, I'm supposed to feel great, that they're about to get him, and yet that moment reverses this.
And M is the figure of reversal because it's a letter that is spelled, or if you divide it, it's the mirror image of its first half.
Right.
But that reversal does characterize what you said about the patterns of identification, that Beckert is the only exception to an identification, in fact, building up against all expectation. Whereas with the other characters with whom we would identify much more naturally in a melodramatic film, like the children, like the mothers, or the good police inspector, that identification is undercut and displaced systematically. The mothers are shown as negligent. In one case, they're also associated with the prostitutes. In every whore there's a mother's heart, and that goes backwards. The children are shown as total accomplices to what is going on. Not only do they sing this song in the beginning, they really beg for it, but the one girl picks up the knife and gives it to Beckert, uncle, your knife. The police uses rather unfair methods of investigation, and in fact, even the negative identification, the typecasting of the gangsters is subverted because the gangsters are in fact the most effective group in this film.
And they have a bureaucracy that truly works. They have a set of relations with others that's not impeded in the ways in which the official people have it. How do you? No, go on, please, John.
One of the things that occurs to me, of course, is that part of the whole process of the film is identifying characters, individual characters, in terms of larger groups,
Yeah.
in terms of a kind of community of expression. The children singing at the beginning are participating in their own slaughter, as it were, each one being knifed in turn. But they are a group communicating with one another. And this is a portrait of a kind of social fabric that is extremely vast and, I would say, ironic, as you're saying, that denies us identification with them. I think that the tremendous sympathy that Beckert has comes in part from his failure to fit into any single group. He is, in some ways, a criminal, but he's rejected by that group. Peter Lorre is in some ways childlike and innocent. His face is very much like the faces of the children that he's murdering, yet he cannot quite fit into that group as well. So that I think there's a tragedy here in this character of what happens in terms of this larger social mechanism to an individual who does not fit in, that I think might be addressed in terms of political developments in Germany at that period. What is the individual who's not like the others, the Jew perhaps? What is that person's place within the larger social fabric? And to what extent is there a kind of justice imposed upon our hero, if you will, that is determined by a society that is itself corrupt?
I would think that the film was definitely read like that when it was produced and released in Germany at the time. And I think Lang actually reported that he was not allowed to start shooting with a title like Mörder unter uns, because the German word murder could be singular and plural, murderer and murderers. And it was immediately read as an anti-Nazi script. And then, of course, when he revealed that it was about this famous child murderer in Düsseldorf, he got the go-ahead. But I think it's very important to understand the whole treatment of justice in the film as referring to flagrant discourses at the time, because the Schrenker figure, the gangster figure played by Gründgens, who, by the way, was a famous stage actor who played Mephisto, spouts Nazi rhetoric. This beast has to be exterminated, the advocacy of lynching, of a populist kind of justice, was understood at the time, could only have been understood in the context of the Nazis rising to power. And by 1931, the institutions of liberal justice were already so weakened that none of these cases were prosecuted anymore. So the representative of liberal justice at the end, the lawyer in the kangaroo court, is in effect the voice of Weimar democracy, and the comic tone is there in a very ironic and tragic sense.
This whole question of where the authority for justice is that seems to disintegrate in the film. I mean, it seems to be distributed, and where exactly do we find it? Actually leads us to a famous anecdote about Lang. And the Nazis, couldn't make up their mind about him in a number of ways, because on the one hand, a number of the films that he made were, from their point of view, not necessarily Lang's, susceptible to an interpretation that they could accept. I mean, it's reported that Hitler's favorite film was Metropolis. And of course, the famous story about Lang, whose wife did turn out to be a party member, is that he was brought into the offices of Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, and offered the directorship of the German film industry because of the Fuhrer's admiration of him. And as the apocryphal story goes, perpetuated by Mr. Lang himself, he immediately accepted the position, went home, packed his bags, and took a train and went to Paris, leaving his wife, his savings, and everything, knowing that the best thing he could do was leave town. The worst thing he could do was tell them no. But still, they somehow saw them improperly, I think, could see themselves in him and not understand that it's ultimately a critique of what's going on in the culture at that particular moment.
Yeah, in a very strange sense, it's their misreading of the Brechtian form of presentation.
Right.
Lang just demonstrates how the machine works, and they think it's right. But there's also an ironic thing here, that if we consider what gives the gangsters authority in the film and what makes the gangsters' investigation prevail or always be a
Right.
step ahead of the police investigation, they're very curious things. On the one hand, the gangsters have a profit motive. They're organized like a capitalist corporation. So they have a much more vital interest in catching this man than the police. But I think it's also interesting the way Lang distributes the cues that lead to the apprehension of the murderer along the axis of sound cues, acoustic cues, and visual cues.
Right.
The gangsters' cues are the whistling of the Greek tune, when the nail in the attic, when Laurie tries to make a key
Right.
out of the nail. What else? The police is always associated with visual matter, photographs, written documents, and even the alarm at the end that gets them into the office building is immediately translated from the sound into ticker tape, and they
Right.
read it off the ticker tape. Would you
No,
have any sense of why Lang gave sound that advance, that prerogative of being the more effective method of criminal investigation there?
On one level, the sound is more intuitive in a way. It's less rational, as music and sound effects are perceived as being not rational, not like language. I think that the criminal element is kind of attuned to an existence of the city, the underworld, if you will, that is unseen, that establishes itself verbally with sound effects, whereas the police department is seen as being an accumulator of reports and photographs and testimony that has very little relationship, you might say, to the real operations of the society.
Well, might there also be the fact that, they're associated with sound because sound is also the new thing, the technology that will be most exciting to an audience, and so there's this, historical alliance of the new technology with the characters to make them more attractive.
Well, there could be a little bit of social Darwinism there,
Right.
which makes me feel very uncomfortable because it would associate the new technology with the gangster syndicate.
Yeah, but there's the way in which they're not really held back by the. To say again, they have this efficient bureaucracy that, as you just said, it's efficient because it's run by profit motive. It has to be. It has to be efficient. If it's not efficient, then it won't work because they're working outside these bounds. So they're the people who have to be associated with these new developments. If I can stop just for 1 second, what I wanted to see was, where does this film lead us? I mean, we've only got a minute or two left. And what's the kind of? Do you see a legacy for M in some way?
One issue I think that M raises is a very broad one, and that has to do with the whole notion of an investigation, and especially in the investigation of criminal activity that's rooted in irrational impulse. What M presents us with are the forces of reason and intuition, you might say, the legal establishment in the underworld, attempting to understand and to bring to the surface, to make visible this irrational force of Laurie. They ferret him out finally,
Right.
and force him to speak and explain himself. A film like Psycho, I think, has certain similarities, although they're different structurally. Both of them have at the center this creature who is irrational, and at the periphery, series of characters who try to understand, to capture, to rationalize this character. And the rationalization is always fails.
You know, what we're going to have to. I'm sorry. I have to cut you off. I hate doing this. We can talk about this as things go, but what we have to end with is that this begins this legacy of films, I think, that represent the irrational in this modern mechanistic society. But if you'd like to know more, not about irrationality in society, but really about this film series, or about cinema then, cinema now, or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate, at the College of Staten Island, please drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me repeat that for you, okay? That's Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, Miriam, I'm sorry to have had to cut you off, and
I was going to open a whole other can of worms.
Another can of worms, another day for another can of worms. John, thank you also for
I got
coming.
the last word in.
You got the last word in. Great for you, Belton. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for joining us, and I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. See you next week, I hope. Bye-bye. Well, what was this? Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today, we begin a 5-part series, Expressionism in Film. Our first film is going to be the 1919 classic, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This film is one of the most influential, most loved, and most hated films in film history. We'll be chatting about all of those things after the film. We have 2 guests, Professor Rosemary Bledders of the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University and Professor Tony Pippolo of Queensborough Community College of the City University of New York. Enjoy The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
In the midst of
Hi. Welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's an unusual film, a very, very rich film in a whole set of ways. I think we have a lot to talk about in the next 30 minutes. But before we jump into the discussion, I'd like to take this moment to introduce to you the 2 guests we have today. My first guest, sitting to my left, is Professor Rosemary Bledders. She's taught interdisciplinary seminars on German Expressionism at Yale, Columbia, and Barnard College. Her specialty as an academic is actually modern architectural history, and as a matter of fact, she's worked on a number of documentaries about modern architecture. She's the co-author of Skyscraper Style, Art Deco in New York. At the moment, she's working on a book on Bruno Taut, a German Expressionist architect. To my right, I have my colleague from the City University of New York, Tony Pippolo. Tony teaches film and literature at Queensborough Community College. He's published widely. His articles have appeared in October, the Film Journal, the New York Times, and a number of other publications. In addition, Tony's one of the editors of 2 film periodicals, Millennium Film Journal and Persistence of Vision, which is the official journal of the City University of New York Film Faculty Consortium.
Right.
Well, Rosemary, I'd like to turn to you first, because this is the initiating film in a series called Expressionism in Film, so it might be just a good place to start with the simple question, how expressionist is this film, and how does it fit into the context of expressionism in the arts?
Yeah, I think it's generally called an expressionist film. In the arts in general, it falls somewhere in between. Expressionism in painting occurred largely before the war.
Okay.
This film in particular is more of an art film than most German films are, so I think it falls in between the most popular medium, the commonly seen film, and the high arts. I think there are some expressionist elements picked up from the high arts. In fact, the set designers had in mind, first of all, the paintings by Alfred Kubin, who is sometimes called an expressionist, but is not a very good example of expressionist art. He certainly is not as expressionist as someone like Kandinsky or one of the Brücke artists. He really belongs more to the turn of the century art. Nevertheless, they did not choose him in the end, and the set designers produced their own design, which has expressionist elements in it. The film originally was tinted in bluish tones, green and brown, so it had a kind of color imposed on it that lent it a greater liveliness than it seems to have now. In their set designs, they used extensively, I think, an anti-naturalist approach, which one could call expressionist.
Right.
It's a kind of anti-materialism, avoiding the objects as such. They also used paint to emphasize figures. For instance, the criminal, when he's sitting in his prison cell, is sitting in the not César, the criminal who is assumed to have been the murderer.
Right,
yeah.
yes,
When he's visited in the prison cell by Francis, he sits in the center of the room, and painted lines, white painted lines, converge on him.
Right.
So he becomes the visual core of this image. Later on, when Jane is in the asylum yard, white lines converge on her. They're like inverted rays of the sun. They come toward her, pointing to the figure.
Let me stop you for just a second, because I mean, I agree with everything you said. Expressionism is one of those words that has a kind of common coinage in our culture. I mean, another one of those words being surrealism, and it's moved. It's an art movement that's moved from a very specific historical context and a very specific set of artistic features, and now it's sort of fuzzy around the edges as it's moved up into popular coinage. What are some of the things from the visual arts that you think characteristic? I mean, that characterize expressionism itself.
Well, what is commonly said is that it's jagged lines, and that's not true at all. In fact, in this film, you find both jagged lines and also scalloped forms, softly curving forms that are used in similar ways. And I think expressionism, even in the high arts, is difficult to define as a formal device because it's not a simple series of forms. What characterizes it much more is this anti-naturalism, a rejection of 19th century positive values about the material quality of bricks, of hard edges, etc. So you get a kind of diffused effect and a kind of spiritualism in some of the arts, especially in the work of Kandinsky.
Right.
And I think that comes through in a very popularized mode in the film. And it's not one formal system, it's not only jagged lines. One also commonly associates expressionism with self-expression. It is that to some degree, it isn't always. It is also to some degree, especially in the expressionism of the post-war period, it becomes also social expression. And that's especially true in the architecture.
Okay.
But one should not only think of it.
No, because this is terrific what you've done, because what you're showing is that it's a set of concerns. There's no single feature at all. And so what we have is a kind of mobile grouping of things.
It's just like Gothic architecture is not just pointed windows. It's a whole constellation of elements that need to converge for it to become this kind of a style. But in Germany, you have the further difficulty. It didn't have one center as France did in Paris, but it had many centers, and this kind of political division that reflects 19th century Germany continues in the arts even after 1918. There are many divisions in the arts, and it depends whether you're talking about Berlin Expressionism, Munich Expressionism. So it is a much more complicated issue in the arts in general than if you're dealing with French art.
Let me use that notion of the arts in general to move over to Tony to try to illuminate another aspect of this. Tony, I want to begin asking you a question actually by interjecting a quotation. And this is a quotation from someone many of our viewers I think are probably familiar with, the great Soviet director, Sergei Eisenstein. As a matter of fact, in an earlier series on the show, we were showing Ivan. No, we were not showing Ivan the Terrible. We were showing Alexander Nevsky. Okay, get that straight. In any case, after the initial screenings of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1919, it was an extremely controversial film, and everybody felt they had to put in their 2 cents on what their opinion about this strange, this exotic artifact was. Here's what Eisenstein said about it. I think we'll get the general idea that he wasn't terribly pleased with the direction that film could take. Eisenstein called the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari this barbaric carnival of the destruction of the healthy human infancy of our art, that is cinema. This common grave for normal cinema origins, this combination of silent hysteria, party-colored canvases, daubed flats, painted faces, and unnatural broken gestures and actions of monstrous chimeras. I get an idea that Sergei wouldn't have been voting Academy Award Best Picture of the Year.
But who could follow that, really?
No.
No, I think that we'd have to understand certainly that statement of Eisenstein's, as many others, in the context of the period, I don't know exactly when he wrote that, but certainly at the period that he was writing, as well as film theorists like Rudolf Arnheim in Germany, Bela Balash and so forth, there was, of course, a very strong tendency to want to justify film as a sort of separate art, which meant that, among other things, it had to sort of throw off the legacy of the stage and anything that sort of smacked of theatrical kind of artificiality. And I think that what Eisenstein is quite rightly, in some sense, and if you look at it in a certain context, reacting to, is the attempt to move film or to seem to keep film attached to these origins rather than to move away to the strength of editing and montage, which was, of course, his main concern, you know, at that time. But I think that now we would look at the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, certainly in many ways. I mean, my recent viewing of it has shown that it looks much more interesting and striking than it looked originally. And if we think about it as a kind of a key film, which some people who have written about it do, there are several books that actually use it as a focal point for histories of film. One can see that, you know, the gestures, both the expressionist gestures and other gestures, the narrative motifs, the use of the character of Caligari himself as a kind of, you know, tyrannical controlling figure who wants to mesmerize and control people from afar, that one can see the entire history of the horror film sort of encapsulated in Caligari, and you see it certainly in the early Hollywood films of the 30s, the Jekyll and Hyde films and so forth, Dracula, the vampire films, the cycles of the 40s, the cycles of the 50s. There is even a remake, by the way, of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is not easy to see, made in 1962.
62? Where was it?
I
made
believe
in Germany?
so. No, I think it's an English or an American film. I'm not quite sure. I've seen it, you know, maybe a long time ago. I don't quite remember it, but it's not a very good
right.
or memorable film, as you can.
Well, there was even influence
guess.
on German expressionist films. In Nosferatu, for instance, the use of the shadow to show a kind of premonition of evil approaching that doesn't show the actual person, and that again is a typically expressionist device. That
And you see it in Caligari
yes,
too.
in Caligari, as the César is about to kill his victim, you see the shadow rather than him. That's really an expressionist device to not show the person, but to show a reflection of that. And in fact, the German films, and then of course American films too.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is that this some scholars have charged that this is very, very distinctly German, and unquestionably this comes out of a particular artistic context there. But there are a couple of film scholars, we were chatting about this a little bit earlier, that blame a great deal on Caligari. I mean, that seem to think of it as a prophetic moment in film, not only, you know, prophetic of the whole tradition of horror films that will become international, but prophetic of the German film industry and how the German film industry, you know, serves as being symptomatic of what Germany's going through at this time. This is, of course, the Siegfried Kracauer.
Kracauer wrote a book in 1947 called From Caligari to Hitler, which tells you his whole attitude. Now, one can understand the negative point of view he takes, and it's mostly in relation to the content, that it suggests something about Germans being controlled, like somnambulists predicting Hitler. I think that's history by hindsight. I don't give it much credence. I think his interpretation of the content of the film is not correct. Nevertheless, one can criticize the film on some points. I think there are some aspects that are not really very expressionist or very good. It was, of course, made immediately after the war, when the material difficulties were extreme, and one sees that in the film. It looks very theatrical, it looks very stagey, the camera is very still, you can see the floorboards, they didn't do anything to cover them up, and painted light, according to the producer, is there not because it's an expressionist device, but they couldn't afford to have the proper lighting. They had run out of their budget. So you can explain some of these shortcomings in terms of the difficulties of the period, and one should compare it perhaps with a slightly later film called The Golem, for which the set design was more generous and which was done by an architect, which has a more rounded, fuller, three-dimensional substance. It's also expressionist, but not quite as two-dimensional as this film seems to be.
Yeah, but there is something about those sets. I mean, I've read also the arguments that one of the producers of this film, talking about why the films come about this way, not talking about the restriction of the materials, also simply talked about the fact that they were exploiting the aesthetic of German expressionism for good old-fashioned capitalist reasons, market differentiation, that they were in competition with American film, and so they needed to make a different kind of product and offer it to an audience and hope that they would buy that sort of thing. I mean, certainly that's a, you know, I think that's a partial kind of answer and truth, but...
Yeah, it was made as an art film for export, not primarily for German audiences. Okay. And in that sense, one could see it as a public relations product.
Yeah. Could I inject in here that with in relation to Krakow, his primary gripe, and this is kind of an interesting way to talk about the film's history and how the narrative got the way it got, is that he was primarily attacking the film because he felt that the inner narrative of the film, that is to say the so-called flashback of Francis who's telling the story, he felt to be this very radical statement which was attempting to attack authority and authoritarian structures and so forth as a reflection of the German sentiment after World War I. And then he suddenly says that this entire radicalization is destroyed, is demolished because of this frame narrative that first Fritz Lang is blamed for, then Erich Palmer is blamed for, then Robert Wiene is blamed for, whoever did it. The frame narrative sort of establishes that, of course, this entire story is in the mind of Francis, who is insane. And if you look at the film, I don't think that anybody looking at it carefully could say that the frame narrative really demolishes that quality in the film.
Oh no, not at all. I think I think that's a really interesting point, because visually there's been a whole set of things that have been set up in the film that we'll get back to Rosemary about in a second, that are unsettling visually and are all part of that of that style. But the narrative structure is that way as well, and I think it's a very interesting contrast between this film and how voice-over narration is used, or flashback structures are used typically in Hollywood films of the 30s and the 40s, some of which have subtle and elaborate narrative structures. I mean, obviously we think of Citizen Kane as the pinnacle of this, but all kinds of other films do it as well. Nonetheless, when they do that, when you come back to the person who's telling the story, ultimately you know where that person stands in some sense in telling the story. This film demolishes that kind of certainty about about this, and I guess following your point, makes it all the more unsettling.
Yeah, well, not only that, but it's also the very fact that, of course, I mean, Krakauer says, I mean, if you take Krakauer literally, it would seem that if the film ended where Francis goes into this hospital and manages to convince in about 30 seconds, you know, all of the interns and people working there that Caligari is insane. They read the books, they go through his documents overnight, and then they put him in a straitjacket when they show him that, you know, Cesare is dead. This is an incredibly sentimental and totally unrealistic, of course, kind of conclusion. And what the framework does is to reintroduce the authoritarian structure that is a real one, that exists, of course, in not only the German society, which is far more, as you say, far more disturbing, far more unsettling, in that it says that however one feels or however one rebels against this authoritarian structure, there are these institutions set up to take care of people like that. We will cure you. We will make you adjust. You know, it's far more upsetting, and it's strange that he did not sort of appreciate that factor in the film. I think he underrates it in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. Let's come back to these ways in which the film is, I think we can call it a visually disturbing film. I mean, putting aside, I think we've already dealt with, you know, the issue of the theatricality. I mean, it doesn't look like other films because today, most of the films that we see, even if they're a science fiction film, are nonetheless done in a naturalist mode. I mean, when you see 2001 or you see Blade Runner, what we're interested in is how effectively they naturalistically, in some sense, create a future. So this film is disturbing not only because it looks theatrical, but because it's so aggressively non-naturalistic. I mean, how do you think it achieves that?
Yeah, I think despite the limitations of technical background that they had at the time, I think they were also using them at the same time. So you could complain about the flatness of the sets, but I think they were taken advantage of on the other hand. And one of the set designers, Warm, said these are drawings come to life, which I think is a good description. They're not lifelike, but their drawings come to life. Their anti-naturalistic drawings come to life, I would have to say, to be more precise. And I think because of the tight space that they worked in, there is something very claustrophobic about the sets. They try to show a kind of space, but again, very unnatural, by almost always having the sets go off to the right or to the left, so one gets a sense of space, but it's not, I mean, there are some long shots in there, but they're not very long shots compared to other films. You don't see into great distance. So you have a kind of illusion of space, but you always know it's dreamlike. It's very close to your sensibilities, and you're bumping into it. And as some of the figures walk through the streets, as when the somnambulist walks through the streets, he walks very close to the walls.
Very sensuously kind of merging with the decor.
And it's almost a camouflaging with the object. So although the figures themselves are not totally camouflaged, which is something you get in some of the later German street films, they are separate, but it's the way the sets are dealt with and the way they come in on the figures that makes you feel very claustrophobic, and that gives it some of that really anxiety that we associate with expressionism also.
Well, it seems like it's doing two things at the same time. On the one hand, it's not giving us a set of boundaries, because this is a small town this is supposed to be happening in. And yet, when we see most small towns in any form of the visual storytelling arts, we can establish a kind of geography of that town, and the directors go out of their way. I mean, how far is it from where these murders happen to the asylum? What is the spatial relationship between those? How is he coming, this is a small town, how is he coming across an asylum that he didn't really know was exactly there before? So those kinds of, that normal mapping of space is disintegrated for us.
You're not given any sense of place, and I think they go out of their way to give a dreamlike sense of space, where you're always confused, you think you cannot find your way back, and spaces end up in strange funnel-like spaces. And again, they're not always jagged, but whether they're rounded or jagged, they create the same kind of emotive space, and I think that's very important what they do through this.
Well, and very much like a dream. I mean, the dream, of course, you know, juxtaposes spaces totally irrationally without any logical connections and so forth, and therefore that does surprise me too. I mean, I watched it twice in the last week, and that sudden appearance of the institution, you know, around the hill, over the hill somewhere, is just kind of amazing. You know, you wonder, you know, how no one would have known, you know, that Caligari was fooling around in this town, you know, doing all of these things. So it is a psychological landscape rather than a real one.
Yeah, no, and you're right that in that sense it's very unique, because other films that deal with the strange or the future, by comparison, even contemporary films like Clockwork Orange or Brazil are comparatively naturalistic. They have sometimes strange objects in them because they're futuristic, but they're not irreal as the sets in Caligari are. So there's a real contrast. In that sense, I think the film is somewhat unique, and I think it tells us something about the German post-war years, but not everything, because one would have to compare it to other films as well. And I think it's certainly a very special film in that sense.
Well, although one thing I was just going to pick up on what you said, I think comparatively is a key word, because Kubrick, I think, is certainly not, you know, exactly a completely restfully naturalistic director. I mean, I do think that in the same way that the Caligari sets sort of work in this dynamic tension, you know, with the action, I think that Kubrick is also working against a certain kind of format. There's this naturalism, but against it is this, you know, totally unreal and almost surreal kind of environment that is placed in exaggerated scale of shots. If you think of The Shining, with, you know, exaggerated kinds of use of this space, it's a kind of a hyperbolic use of space as a kind of
or for instance,
vast landscape of the mind.
The room that he has at the end of 2001, which is a Louis XVI room in outer space, but it's naturalist. I mean, the only reason we see it as surreal is the juxtaposition with outer space, and so it belongs more in a surreal realm rather than expressionism, because it juxtaposes two separate realities, and by their being close to each other, they become unreal. But what he shows in itself, the separate elements, are not exaggerated or distorted as they are in Caligari.
This is interesting. I want to just follow up on The Shining for a second, because there is the interesting feature. I suspect many of our viewers have seen The Shining. You know, taking this legacy, I mean, The Shining is released in 80, 81, something of that sort, early
80, I think,
81. I mean, that's a full 60 years after Caligari, and there's a indigenous American tradition by that time of a certain kind of horror film. In The Shining, it strikes me that while we couldn't call, I think, The Shining an expressionist film, there's nonetheless this attempt to bring back into horror film elements of this tradition. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Tony, that this becomes not as profoundly as in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but increasingly this becomes the landscape, the landscape of Jack's mind in The Shining. And also, The Shining has that same kind of strange narrative ending, because as many people who've seen it will remember, we finally find out that the Jack Nicholson character has somehow been dwelling in this hotel.
He belongs there.
He belongs there since because he's in this picture from the 20s. So there's that confounding of the normal dimensions of time and space that we find incredibly characteristic of Caligari.
Which leaves it deliberately ambiguous in the same way that some horror films, you know, have been prone to do. But also the other thing, what I was saying before about, or what you were saying, in terms of the relationship, I think that in film, including in Caligari, I mean, the term expressionism, I think, as you rightly say, has been sort of loosely thrown about, but I think that it came to mean really something very specific in film. It came to mean really a kind of metaphorization of a certain psychological state in visual terms. And I think that in that sense, although I agree that Kubrick is not expressionist, I think that there is a certain kind of abstract expressionism that he's working within. And a lot of it has to do with sort of using spatial dynamics to express certain kinds of psychological dynamics.
I think that's very much the case. I want to give a plug just for a second for a film that's less well known, that I think incorporates many of the features of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's a film called The Shout. It was made it's an English language film. Right, made by the Polish emigre director Skolimowski. It's got, I mean, if we want to talk about stars, it's got Alan Bates and John Hurt and Susanna York, but it has the same frame narrative that Caligari has, and it begins in an insane asylum. Somebody comes to visit.
I forgot that, really.
Yeah, it comes, and there's a wonderful moment in which the Bates character is talking to the head psychiatrist, and he says, well, what's mad? And the psychiatrist, played by Robert Stevens, a distinguished English actor, points at one tree, and he says, well, you know, that tree is mad. And then he points at another tree, and he said, now that tree is sane. And even before this kind of strange story of a man who had a death shout begins, told by a madman, and it's kind of saying, I don't get it. By what standards are we judging these things anyway? I wasn't acquainted with mad trees before, and this is the head of the asylum who's saying that. And I think The Shout strikes me as one of the most successful adaptations of this unsettling expressionist aesthetic in contemporary film. Not a film that disturbed a lot of people, but not in the ways they're used to being.
Yes, true.
Used to being disturbed. Yeah. I want to come back. You know, we've talked about painting some, Rosemary. What about this whole notion of architectural space and expressionism? And we've got an architectural historian here, and granted, you know all the rest of the stuff, but we haven't really talked about that at all.
Yeah, well, expressionism in architecture is somewhat later than in painting.
Okay.
Again, because architecture is much more tied to the economy, to commissions, whereas painting had been cut loose from that since the 19th century. Painters turned toward expressionism much later, only during and after the war when there were no commissions. And then only because they turned to drawings, and in their drawings they sometimes express expressionist ideas. But there it becomes something different. You can't compare it to the paintings of Kandinsky in a particular sense, except that they were inspired by that, in producing anti-materialist architecture. And of course, it's a contradiction of terms, and they had tremendous difficulties. What was depicted by an architect like Taut was an international society. It was a pacifist statement. Buildings that were often done with crystalline, glassy effects, which is a very long, ancient symbol of transformation. It's used in the images of the Holy Grail and carries all the way through Romantic literature that was picked up again by them. So it stands for transformation into a new society. And what he proposed is that really the construction of earthworks, what in today's sculptural terms you would call earth art, the reconstruction of the Alps, for instance, and that to me contains a basic criticism of contemporary culture in Germany. You don't accept it as a given. You reconstruct nature. Again, you get this perversion of naturalism. You reconstruct nature into a new setting. And he also proposed that the whole society work on these buildings as he assumed people did in the Middle Ages, which of course is a romantic myth, but the belief that somehow being involved in that kind of constructive work would keep you from carrying out warfare, so that the building, the constructing itself became a symbol for a pacifist statement.
Which is very interesting in light of this film, I think in two ways. I mean, one, because this is a film about a community that is threatened. And I mean, you know, we've talked about the ways in which, you know, Francis may not be our best stable spokesperson for the community, but at least he claims that what he's trying to do is hold a community together in some kind of in some kind of way for this, and that's I mean, that could be linked with what's then coming, or it's that same cultural moment. Well. Tony, we're running out of time really, really rapidly here, but I was just going to give you a shot to name a couple of films from Hollywood, if you wanted, that you think, 30s and 40s films that are influenced by this, because this is the kind of thing that'll pop up on television that people can look for.
Well, I think that if anyone is also interested in looking into this book by S. Prower called Caligari's Children, he traces the influence of Caligari in, for example, films like Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie. I Walk with a Zombie, is that the right title of that film?
With a Zombie, sure.
The Leopard Man and films of the 40s. And you can see, if you look at stills or look at the film Night of the Hunter in the 50s, directed by Charles Lawton with Robert Mitchum, almost identical kinds of compositions and so forth, and gestures and body movements and so forth that also resemble, you know, the kind of legacy of
So not only is
Caligari.
there's going to be a
Goes
lot
all
of
the way.
a lot of expressionism in the next 4 weeks on the series, but those people who like going through their TV guides and marking, getting that VCR ready for the 3 a.m. Screening, are going to be able to find elements of this legacy
Right.
very, very,
Oh,
very,
I think so, definitely.
very, very, very strongly. Well, if you'd like more information about our series, about Cinema Then, Cinema Now, or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate, why don't you drop us a note? Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that information another time, okay? Write to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, Rosemary, it's been a pleasure having you here, bringing your expertise on interdisciplinary matters to it. And Tony, as always, it's a pleasure having a fellow CUNY colleague on the show.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for joining us. I hope that our discussion here, as I always say at the end of the show, leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us this week. Hope to see you in weeks to come. Well. Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today we'll be seeing our second film in our 5-part series, Expressionism in Film. We'll be seeing the 1922 German production directed by F.W. Murnau, Nosferatu. This is the first important vampire film and the first of many adapted from Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. We'll be talking about vampirism, expressionism, and a lot of other isms after the film. To do that with us, I will have two guests, Professor Gilberto Perez from Sarah Lawrence College and Professor Foster Hirsch from Brooklyn College. Enjoy the supremely creepy Nosferatu. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed, were intrigued by F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu from 1922. We have two guests today, as always, to discuss the film, and I'd like to take this moment to introduce both of them to you. To my left, I have a colleague from the CUNY system, Professor Foster Hirsch, who teaches in the film department at Brooklyn College. Foster is the author of a number of books, including The Dark Side of the Screen, film noir, as well as books on Laurence Olivier, Tennessee Williams, Woody Allen, and the Actors Studio. At the moment, he's working on two more books, one called Great Screen Acting, a contract with Harry Abrams, and another, Harold Prince and the American Musical Theater, which he's doing for the Cambridge University Press. To my right, I have Professor Gilberto Perez, who teaches film history at Sarah Lawrence College. In addition, he teaches at the School of Visual Arts. His many articles include publications in the Hudson Review, Raritan, Art Forum, and Sight and Sound. In fact, some 20 years ago, his very first article publication was in Sight and Sound and was on a film called Nosferatu. So we're lucky to have Gil with us today. At the moment, he is trying to finish off a book which will be called Point of View of a Stranger, which incorporates some of his writing from the article on Nosferatu all the way towards a recent article on Godard and Antonioni. Gil, I thought we might start with you, and the audience, or those of, I'll say, lucky enough to have tuned in last week for the first show in this series, saw Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, famous expressionist film. This film that we've just seen both fits in with Caligari in a set of ways, and it doesn't fit with Caligari in a set of ways. I mean, how would you fit it with, and how would you not fit it?
Well, I think I'd like to begin by talking about how it doesn't fit with Caligari. And one of the notable things about Nosferatu is the extensive and prominent use of nature in the film, of actual places. The Carpathian Mountains around the castle itself is a real castle, then the ship and the sea, the waves, and then the Baltic town. Those narrow streets and those closely packed houses with Nordic architecture, they're certainly not merely a backdrop. They have a central importance in the film. And that's definitely quite a contrast with Caligari and with most of the films in the Expressionist period at this time in Weimar, Germany.
Right.
And Murnau, not only Nosferatu, but in some of his other films, he had a feeling for nature. In some of his early films made around the same time as Nosferatu, he often used nature. And then in the films that made his reputation, The Last Laugh and Faust in Germany, those were done in the studio in accordance with the practice of German films at that time. But after he left Germany and he went to Hollywood and made Sunrise and City Girl and then Taboo in the South Seas, which was his last film, there again he started using nature. And one of the very interesting things about Murnau's work is his combination of actuality and artifice, of expressionist stylization and the use of natural landscape and actual places.
Still, you know, this film has about it, shares with Caligari the sense of claustrophobia. It's not created in the same ways, but...
in a way, it does have a sense of claustrophobia, though you might say it has also a sense of agoraphobia.
Okay.
Because the film is full of these uneasy, empty spaces. You know, that whole sequence of the plague, when the plague breaks out in the town, is done mostly in long shots with the camera at a distance and with a lot of air in those shots, a lot of empty spaces. And, well, maybe the most remarkable shot in the whole film, the most remarkable image is that view from the wife's window, looking out into the street with a window bar in the foreground, and then in the distance, all those coffins being carried down the street. And that's a view in which maybe the most threatening thing about this is the air. That sense that the whole air seems permeated by death, by the plague, and it seems to reach out toward you with that window bar, signaling her point of view and bringing the space of the film toward us. So, yeah, it is oppressive, but you see what I mean by agoraphobia rather than claustrophobia.
But the two, that's interesting because the two so frequently go together. There's a fear of spaces in one way, or another. Well,
but I think just to continue that idea, the sense of nature in the film is still threatening. You often think of nature in film as being open or celebrating a kind of openness, but not in Nosferatu. Nature is as intimidating as the interior spaces in the film. And what Murnau does really is to transform the real world into artifice. I think one of the theories of German film of the time was that of directorial control. That one of the reasons that the expressionists liked to work in the studio was that they had absolute control over every element of the mise en scène. And then when a director like Murnau, who favored nature, would take his camera into the real world, it's not because he relinquished in any sense that control that seems so necessary, because nature in that film is deformed for thematic purposes that ride through the forest with the negative. And
Yes.
I mean, that's studio. Look, it has the imprint of studio on it. It's nature made artificial and metaphoric.
Well, I would say it's nature seen in a very special way. The images are often beautifully and arrestingly composed, and I wouldn't say they are composed. They are composed, but I wouldn't say that they become tantamount to the studio. They retain that quality of nature, but I would say nature seen through a consciousness, composed through a consciousness, and it's usually an apprehensive, a fearful consciousness that is composing these images and seeing nature that way.
I feel in Murnau's films and in the later films like Sunrise that you often can't tell when it's studio and when it's the real world. And I think that confusion is deliberate.
Oh, well, I mean, if we just go back to Nosferatu for a second, we've got, of course, the sequence in which he arrives on his way to Dracula's castle. And the coachman he's with said, "We go no further. This is where the phantoms begin." And at the moment when you say this, you look, there's a bridge, and you say, "What are you talking about?" You know, nature looks the same on either side of this. And then, of course, the coach is dispatched, and Murnau uses the fast motion, fast motion to get there. But still, there's this way in which, where are these boundaries? Where exactly? I mean, somehow experience has taught those coachmen this is where the phantoms begin, but at least the initial natural marker of a boundary is a simple bridge. That's a bridge between one side of a little creek or a river, not a bridge between one world and another, and it becomes, I think, even more than a world of spirits and a world of the normal peasants, but it becomes, and this kind of gets us back to what I think Gil was saying, this world of a breakdown between the subjective and the objective.
A deliberate confusion and interpenetration, and you feel, at least I feel in the film, that the supernatural is always ready to pounce onto the natural, that they're so interconnected, and you get right from the beginning the sense of threat and menace, intimidation. It's a film from the first shot that tells you something awful is going to happen.
Yeah. Of course,
Yes.
I was just thinking that Renfield says you can't run away from.
It wasn't Renfield. It's the professor.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, it's fun.
Pardon me for
No, please, because
Renfield is insane.
Is insane,
he wouldn't deliver such a
right. And it's the
calm
professor
line.
who tells him you cannot run away from fate, young man.
Yes.
I stand corrected.
Okay.
But it looked like you were thinking about those first shots of the film and the way in which.
Well, I was actually thinking about images such as that shot of the frightened horses through the window, which are you know, that's very much an image from nature, undistorted by any obvious thing like use of negative film or speeded up motion, and yet rather spooky, frightening, strange.
Yes.
And I quite agree that there is that interpenetration that Foster was talking about between the natural and the supernatural. And the two are combined in the film.
In a sense.
But this is not the same thing as to say that the natural is turned into the artificial, but rather you might as easily say the other. You might as easily say that nature is then seen as permeated with the sense of threat, of strangeness, of the supernatural, just in the same way that, the vampire himself, who is probably the most striking expressionist, stylized element in the film, the monstrous vampire. When he arrives into the town, he then disappears. We don't see him throughout the whole sequence of the plague. and it's as if the vampire had dissolved into the air. And what we see is, you know, people carrying coffins, the streets of the town, nothing distorted, nothing obviously supernatural. At that point, the supernatural, as embodied in the vampire, has spread out into the actual world and become, as it were,
I think,
embedded
though,
in it.
that is the reason that, for me, the film is more frightening than Caligari, because Caligari takes place in a totally protected and enclosed environment, the studio, the theater.
Right.
It's fake. But Nosferatu, set in the real world, then introduces these elements of threat and terror, which thematically, and I guess we'll talk about the implications of that, are more terrifying than something that's totally enclosed.
Oh, because there is that sense, to use a word that I was using a minute or so ago, of this breakdown in boundaries. And so there is this sense of the spillover. And even while the vampire himself is, you know, is initially our center of threat. I mean, he embodies this force, this plague, this evil. There is a way in which, and this is what Gil was talking about a minute or so ago, in which that's dissipated. Not that the evil's dissipated, or rather that it's spread around, I mean, for lack of a better phrase. And so, therefore, it becomes all the more threatening because, well, I mean, just to talk for a moment about contemporary horror films, you know, when you have someone with a chainsaw, you know that it's this one person with a chainsaw, and as soon as you get that, you get rid of it. But here, there's this sense that there is this presence, and it can move. Not only it can move, but its influence can move into all kinds of other domains. And so, how do you get rid of something like this when it has powers to interpenetrate other domains? And that's to me is one of the things that's really terrifying.
The thing is that what the film, in my view, is really about is death, the fear of death, and that you can't get rid of. I mean, death is inescapable, and it is part of the natural world. I see Nosferatu as being a kind of allegory of death, of the fear of death. And then death as embodied in the supernatural figure of the vampire, who looks like a skeleton, a sort of grim reaper, a supernatural symbol of death. But death also as embodied in the plague, which is a natural cause of death. And then ultimately the film being a stare at this world, at this actual world, that is permeated by death. And before I was talking about how the shots are composed, or we were talking about how the shots are composed and give you that sense of an apprehending consciousness, an apprehensive consciousness also. And I see the film as being like that stare out of the window, looking out at that world that is, at this world, that is filled with death, in which death is in the air.
I think, for me, it's more specific than death, and I may be reading into it. I'm clearly reading into it because I know, we all know what happened to Germany, the nightmare that overtook it. And it seems to me that that figure of the vampire is connected to the Caligari archetype of the tyrant. And so it's not just death that this pestilence connotes, but it's a particular kind of doom that must have erupted from the German post-war conditions. I mean, when you get characters like Caligari and the vampire here repeated in German films of this time as they are, that's somehow expressing something even at an unconscious level that's abroad in the culture.
And of course, that's a famous argument in Siegfried Kracauer's book, From Caligari to Hitler, which...
And I can never get that title out of my mind whenever I look at any of these films from this period, From Caligari to Hitler. And so for me, even if we are oversimplifying, it seems to me that all of these films have a kind of ghastly, premonitory quality, that this kind of pestilence that Nosferatu dramatizes was what was to overtake Germany.
Yeah. No, but
I think, I'm sorry.
No, go on.
I think that the Kracauer argument of the tyrant figure and the prefiguring of Hitler has some validity, but I have doubts about it. It's one of those arguments that depends a lot on hindsight.
Very much so.
And so you know Hitler was coming when you look back, so you see Hitler in Nosferatu. But let me ask you, in this connection, if you see Nosferatu as a tyrant figure, that prefigures Hitler. What about the wife? And what about the peculiar bond that the wife seems to have with Nosferatu and the peculiar power?
You're talking again about the famous, another one of the
What?
famous window shots. It's when, I mean, that power, I think, is creepiest in the film when she looks out of her window when she's opened it, and we see Nosferatu standing across the way.
And he seems to be waiting for her. I mean, Nosferatu can have anybody in town. I mean, he's been dominating the town, everybody's dying, except her. She has to open the window and allow him to come, and he's there with an expression of something like longing for her. And only when she opens a window and says, all right, you can come, then this supposedly all-powerful tyrant figure of the vampire, then he can come. She has to let him. Otherwise, she obviously has the power to keep him away. As earlier in the film, she had the power to save her husband from Nosferatu's attack. Over, miles and miles away, she wakes up, she calls out, and Nosferatu listens and stops.
But within the allegory, what would you say she represents?
Well, I see the various characters in the film as embodying, allegorically, different responses to death. For example, the husband is a smiling innocent who travels to the castle and is not worried about anything. We're worried for him. But he seems to take it all with a smile in his stride. But that smiling innocent, when confronted with death, just falls apart. He's helpless. When the vampire is about to attack him, all he can do is crawl in the bed and cover himself. He's completely helpless. And then the wife intervenes to save him. And I see the wife as embodying, in this allegory that I'm proposing, as embodying the type of person who is, you might say, oriented toward death or aware of death. And here we could start talking about the whole sense in someone like Heidegger, or German thought, German existentialism of this period.
Yeah.
The whole sense of the orientation toward death and the attitudes toward death as defining a human being.
Yes, but does she rather represent, and I don't think it's
Yes.
very effective, I must say,
Yes.
the power of love as opposed to the dark powers that the vampire represents, and then there's a confrontation between the two, and I think in the allegory, which I don't
You don't
really
accept.
buy, no,
That's all right.
that the power of love is meant to triumph over the power of death, and isn't, after all, he disappears at the end. He
So does she.
evaporates.
Yeah.
She's dead
Yes,
at the end.
she's
too.
dead too, but hasn't she, in a sense, had a
Haven't made
momentary...
the supreme sacrifice.
But
She is
love for whom? Who is she? Who does she love in the film? If she is love, who does she love? In this bond between her and the vampire, I think you agree that it exists.
Oh,
this
certainly.
peculiar
It's like a telepathic
kinship,
communication almost.
this peculiar kinship between the two. She often seems to bypass her husband.
But not to save him? She's...
Yes, yes, to save him, but remember that when she's waiting supposedly for the arrival of her husband, she's waiting by the sea, at the beach with the waves coming,
and the crosses.
and there's a graveyard, a seaside graveyard, and it's a vampire who's coming by sea, not her husband. So somehow there's a suggestion that she is waiting for the vampire rather than for her husband. And even when the husband arrives, the vampire arrives also, and she says, he's here. He, without a clear antecedent, could refer to either the husband or the vampire. So I'm not saying she doesn't love her husband, I think she does. But somehow she has this sense, this sense of the vampire that seems to bypass the husband. And then at the end, she sends the husband away on some excuse, some errand. She lets the vampire in, and I think that last scene has something unmistakably erotic about it.
Oh,
there's
that-
no
that's
question
question.
of that.
I mean,
There's no
that incredible shot, the long-held shot of him kneeling by the bedside over her. We just see it. We see him so long over her neck.
Yes.
Is I think one of the most stunningly eroticized images in German expressionism, and the shot is held for a long time, so we are allowed to inspect exactly what the relationship between these two bodies are.
But I think what we're talking about in the portrayal of the wife is this interconnection between the natural and the supernatural that we were talking about in the mise en scène.
Right.
Doesn't it exist? She's a character who I see as having a kind of mundane goal to save her husband, but she's invested with these supernatural or telepathic powers that ultimately are supposed to triumph over pestilence. And then I don't agree with it. I think this is an interesting point, that both Caligari and Nosferatu at the end make a kind of half-hearted attempt to eliminate the power of darkness, but we don't buy it in either case. Caligari clearly is embodied in the figure of the asylum director, and I don't see that the pestilence, figure of pestilence is truly eliminated. How can, we've already discussed it, how can you eliminate it?
Well, of course, just visually, just for the second, what we have is he vaporizes, so to speak, and yet we have this sense of his permeation of the entire scene.
We've seen it throughout the latter part of the film.
I mean, just quantitatively, I mean, how much time within the film is invested in showing this, and then to get rid of him, he's vaporized, and then there's a title card that says, and then miraculously everybody was okay.
And I don't accept it. No, I don't accept it. I think they had a feeling of the kind of nightmare that was overtake Germany, and at this earlier part there's a kind of an attempt to deny it and to impose a happy ending, which is not credible.
What about you, Gil? What about this in the ending of the film?
Well, I think really in 1922 to have a feeling for the nightmare that would overtake Germany 10 years later, I think that's not, I mean, obviously there was a lot of dislocation and chaos and anxiety in immediate post-war Germany, and the film was reflecting and expressing that. But to see it as prefiguring what the nightmare that would overtake Germany 10 years after, that seems a little far-fetched to me. But I agree with Foster that at the end we're not really convinced.
The threat is not contained at the end. It's whatever the pestilence represents, it has managed to infect the entire landscape.
Can I try to negotiate a little bit between the two? No, because I think both points of view have validity, and I guess what I would want to do is say that part of the enduring power of this film, and this is a silent film from 1922, however great it may be, it is a cultural artifact that is really quite distant from us in a whole set of ways, and particularly with the rise of new technologies. Still, I think it's a film that can knock people over. And I don't think it knocks people over because either of you are wrong. I think that it's a film that holds within itself multiple kinds of allegories, all of which are inscribed, to be sure, in different ways and with different strengths. And I think it is that, particularly the way in which it like Caligari, it refuses to close itself off. However we connect this with a particular allegory, whether it be a rise of terrible things in Germany, whether it be, as Gil is talking about, death, whether something clearly connected with expressionism, that is abnormal states of psychology and the threat of the irrational as a force within humankind to burst out and manifest itself in in different ways. Whichever of those allegories we choose to emphasize in a particular interpretation of the film, I think part of the strength and the endurance of the film is that it holds all of them within itself so very, very well.
Well, I see I didn't actually get a chance to finish my little allegorical interpretation with the other characters as well. The real estate agent Renfield who goes insane, and the scientist. besides the husband and the wife, there's a real estate agent who's a man who goes insane in his consort with death,
Right.
and becomes some kind of agent of death. And then the scientist, of course, who represents science. And in the middle section of the film, you get this intricate cross-cutting
Yes.
between the different characters. The husband returning, the wife waiting, the vampire on the ship, and then the scientist giving his lessons of biology, of death biology, or vampiric
Right.
biology, and the real estate agent, Renfield, who's insane. And I think that the film gives us this. I would say that, you know, you were talking about different kinds of allegories. I see all these different attitudes as being part of the allegory of death and the fear of death, and different attitudes toward different human attitudes in the face of this world in which we're all doomed to die.
Well, the death might serve as a good way to take us to certain other aspects of the film as well. And what I was thinking of, Foster, because you had mentioned this when we chatted a little bit earlier, is how this film differs from other vampire films. I mean, you know, the 20th century is, I mean, this may be the first and we may argue the greatest, whatever, but certainly everybody knows vampire films and they have their own favorite vampire or whatever. So how do you think this, this film fits in with that tradition? Briefly, because I think we don't have all that much time left.
I don't think we've mentioned the fact that the narrative is based on the Stoker novel Dracula.
Right.
So that is this the first Dracula film? I'm
Yes,
not
it's
sure.
the first. It's the
It
first
is
Dracula.
the first Dracula film. But for me, it is a deeply Germanic Dracula, and I think that's inscribed in the composition. We haven't really talked much about the expressionist elements of the film, the chiaroscuro, the use of space, the coffin motif, the recurrent use of the Gothic arch, the sense of enclosure. The world that the film presents is one of expressionist lighting and expressionist mise en scène, which is a specifically Germanic heritage.
Yeah, and of course that differs. I mean, I think most people, their first Dracula that they think of is Bela Lugosi from Universal Studios coming in the early 30s.
Well, that's an imitation of the Germanic style, after all.
Oh.
I mean, those films were heavily indebted to the German films of the 20s.
Oh, I agree. Yet there's a distinctly Americanized aspect of it as well. I mean, I think that when we get rid of that Dracula, we think we've gotten rid of it. Mind you, he may be coming back in lots of sequels from Universal, but for him to come back in sequels is not the same thing as that sense of...
He does not, the American Dracula doesn't represent that kind of widespread infestation that we were talking about, very clearly. He's one person, and it's a struggle then between good and evil in a sort of simplistic, melodramatic way. Would you agree?
No, I think, I mean...
The American version.
It's an enduring legend, but there are those aspects of widespread, you know, anxiety that can't be somehow gotten rid of or
You feel in the
taken
American
away.
film that it's a struggle between individuals, and if the bad individual is gotten rid of, the battle is over.
Okay.
But
So we end. We gentlemen, I'm sorry to tell you,
time's up.
Our time is up. So we end with the question of, you know, American individualism. How can it relate to this Germanic tradition? Well, if you'd like to know more about this series, Cinema Then, Cinema Now, or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate, at the College of Staten Island, please drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give that information again, okay? Drop that line to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, Foster, I'm sorry to have cut you off because we've just gotten to, you know, a very interesting topic. It's always a pleasure having another CUNY colleague
Good,
along.
thank you.
Okay, Gil, thanks for making time for us and bringing your expertise all the way from your first article published article to this. And thank you for joining us, and I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Bye. Well. Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today, we see our fourth installment in the five-part miniseries, Expressionism in Film. We'll be seeing the 1949 British production, The Third Man, starring Alida Valli, Joseph Cotten, and Orson Welles. This film is famous for its theme song, for its location use of post-war Vienna, and for an astounding performance from Orson Welles. We'll be talking about that and other matters afterwards with today's two guests, Steve Lawson, a writer and television producer, and Professor Darrell Taylor of Queens College of the City University of New York. Enjoy The Third Man.
Does exist.
Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed The Third Man. You're probably still humming that theme song, for better or for worse. I have two guests, as always, here today, and I'd like to take this moment to introduce them to you so we can then start on our discussion. To my left is a colleague of mine from the CUNY system, Professor Darrell Taylor. Professor Darrell tells me he's just completed 20 years, that's incredible, teaching philosophy at Queens College. However, for the last 10 years, he's managed shrewdly enough to teach philosophy through film, and indeed in those years has served as the chair of the film studies program out at Queens College. He's in fact had a number of his colleagues on the show on several other series. To my right,
is that nepotism?
Yeah, well, and speaking of nepotism, we have Steve Lawson, writer, producer, and suspiciously enough, an old friend from college. Steve is also suspicious. Steve is also associate director and literary manager of the Williamstown Summer Theater, which Newsweek has called America's Best Summer Theater. Steve's done a lot of television work. He adapted The Elephant Man from Broadway for ABC. He's written for and was story editor of St. Elsewhere for a couple of years, and at the moment is working on a television movie for CBS, which will celebrate the life of Rachel Carson and the 25th anniversary of the publication of the Silent Spring. Well, having said all of that, I think I'd like to turn to Darrell for the first topic. Darrell, this is the first film out of this series of five. Well, it's the first and it's the only one we're going to be doing from the 40s. The 40s is a remarkable period for expressionism in film, kind of filtered through the thing called film noir. How does The Third Man fit in with this, do you think? It's a British film, and we think of film noir as American, but...
Well, certainly, it's film noir in its look, in terms of narrative line, it has none of the normal storyline kinds of elements that we associate with film noir. Here, the woman is, if anything, sort of angelic. She's not the killer. The usual noir film has the husband engaging a new lover to kill off a husband, double indemnity style, or Postman Who Always Rings Twice, and whatever. And none of that is here. What we have instead is sort of the leftover bits and pieces, I suppose, of the visual look of noir, which everyone attributes to the fact that so many expatriate directors came to Hollywood during the occupation.
And we've got one. I mean, we just last week on the show did Fritz Lang's M, and of course Lang is perhaps the most famous of all those directors to end up.
Yeah, along with Stahl and Brahm and Siodmak and Preminger and Wilder, an enormous number. Zinnemann, and even Hitchcock worked in the UFA studios for a time when he was a young man. Lottie Eisner made the point, I remember, in Haunted Screen, that in fact maybe Expressionism shouldn't be credited for quite so much influence on the films as the older romantic Sturm und Drang tradition in Germany, the novels of E.T.A. Hoffmann, particularly with respect to the notion of the doppelganger theme, the double. And in fact, I think the film The Third Man does connect at that level, because here we have a Holly and a Harry who, if anything, are...
Who she keeps mixing up.
Who she keeps mixing up, and who are light and dark sides of a single person. And the usual Freud interpretation has something to do with the attempt to kill off that dark side, you know. And I think it's also to the point that the entire film takes place in the international zone, that place where law is suspended. Like Scotty in Vertigo, he wanders dangling throughout the whole film in a world halfway between masculinity and femininity. I think it's true in this film as well that Holly's main goal is to find what kind of law still exists in this international zone, and in order to do it he has to kill his oldest and best friend and the only one who made everything fun.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, when I look at The Third Man, I've seen it a lot of times, as we all have, you know, the image that irresistibly comes to mind is the soccer tort that's gone bad.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's Vienna, so that makes sense. But, you know, it's like this, we have this delicious frosting and these wonderful Baroque curlicue ruins, you notice. It's like the death of European culture going on behind the action here. And underneath is this cake made of pure cyanide, you know what I mean? And what you were saying about the whole double theme of, you know, the good man and the bad side and whatever, you know, you always have to come back to that wonderful scene in the Ferris wheel, and which stops when Lime and Holly are at the very top, you know, and they had this very edgy exchange about the ants below and how many ants could you afford free of income tax. I mean, if that isn't Satan taking Jesus to the mountaintop and showing him the wonders of the world, I don't know what it is. You know what I mean? And Satan being the fallen good guy and so on and so forth. This is almost like Holly's dark side tempting him to come over. You know.
And then, of course, there's this whole infantile quality of Holly, the pulp writer, and he's writing the pulp westerns, and it's Sergeant Payne who says, "Mr. Holly Martins."
Yes, the writer.
The writer.
But Harry's infantile too, because he never grew up. The world grew up around him, as Alida Valli says. Right. So they're both kids. She's the old one in the bunch.
Yeah,
you know, she's the complex character, really. You know.
I think that theological theme is picked up throughout the film, even in the title, of course, on the road to Emmaus. They saw a third man walking beside the other two disciples. And, of course, we have a Judas figure, a betrayal of an old friend, and we have... but it's all a reverse parody. It's a parody of the Christological myth, certainly, but here we have a whole new meaning to suffer the children. He's making children suffer by diluting the penicillin, and he's providing, and he, instead of being, he rises from the dead, so to speak, but in fact it's a second death that counts. And instead of coming to bring life, as Trevor Howard says, death is at the bottom of it, and you should leave death to the professionals.
Right.
It's a film about death, ultimately. And I think in that way it's a kind of neat reversal of, and a perfect encapsulation of Graham Greene's style of pessimistic Christianity.
Yes, I know.
Existential Christianity.
Of course, there's this weird, I mean, if we want to just talk about the whole complexity of influence or lines of touching one another, I mean, Graham Greene is somebody who, as a novelist, is influenced on the one hand by, you know, Joseph Conrad, Ford Madox Ford, Henry James, seem to bring that tradition. And, you know, on the other hand, clearly there are people like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and James M. Cain that he knows about. And so in novels like Brighton Rock or whatever, you get this molding of the high culture art novel tradition, and yet all these concerns of the crime novel, etc. And I think that force in Greene gets followed through in this film. It's very much Greene's, not to take anything away from Carol Reed's brilliant visuals, but it is Greene's script in that kind of way.
Well, I think it's a wonderful combination of the two. I mean, you know, Reed and Greene work very well together, of course.
Yeah.
It's a one of the great scenarist-director combinations ever.
You know, The Fallen Idol, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, because the other ones are The Fallen Idol, and then is Odd Man Out, was Graham Greene in?
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah,
yes,
and those three, and you thought about three
Within
peaks.
3 years, too.
Right.
Within 3
yes,
years.
It was
Yes.
quite an explosion of work going on. You know. But, you know, it's interesting, you know, I think the two of them were really responsible for Harry Lime, and then Orson Welles took it to another dimension.
Yeah.
But you think of this film working on what I call the Tartuffe principle, because here's the
Yes.
title character who is discussed for the first half, and then he has to appear, and he has to be overpowering and memorable, and thanks to Orson Welles, he is.
Yeah, that's
but he
true.
is very well set up. And it was very astute, I think, of Carol Reed to cast Joseph Cotton, this recessive, rather dull actor,
absolutely, yeah.
as, you know, this Mr. Nice Guy, as the virtuous hero. Because Holly, I mean, is compared to him, he's white bread.
Right,
And Harry
absolutely.
Lime is Richard III, and he's absolutely irresistible.
And it's handing a piece of cake to Orson Welles after
who is in
past
heaven, of course.
acting jobs with him.
Absolutely.
He was quite comfortable with that.
And as he was directed and written and played, he has more than a hint of the supernatural about him. The fact that he
absolutely.
rises from the dead, as you said, Daryl. And also the fact the first time we see him, he appears in this explosion of light with a cat for a familiar. Like the devil has appeared, you know, with that lopsided grin he has, you know. It's remarkable. And what I think is very clever of Greene and Reed is for all of the crimes that Lime we know has committed, we never see him doing anything.
Absolutely, and which you might even call the Macbeth principle.
Sure.
Because he's always using agents, or it takes place off screen
Yes.
or one way, and it's
We don't even see the kids in the hospital. We see Joseph Cotton's
just
reaction.
looking
We do
into
not
the
see
cribs,
the
yeah.
children stricken by the penicillin.
And what's it's in Calloway's response? He says we should have dug in deeper.
Yes. Yes. Next time we'll have a
Deeper than the
foolproof
grave.
coffin.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
deeper
Right.
than the grave. It's
Right.
going to be the source. Yeah.
I mean, he's a terrible, terrible, terrible man, but he's very charming.
But of course the Alida Valli character Anna, at one point when I guess it's Cotton who's pontificating, and he's been convinced of this. She keeps saying, "You tried to make him into something else."
Yeah.
To me,
Harry was Harry.
Harry was Harry.
Yeah.
What are you trying to do?
Yes, he wasn't you. I mean, he was more than your friend and my lover. He was Harry.
Right.
You know, and that shows her that she's really a very complex character. I think.
Yeah, and-
She is she's Europe. You
Well,
know?
yes,
and at
yeah.
the end, here's America. Here's Joseph Cotton comes over and tries to clean up Europe like the Marshall Plan. And he stands and said, "Well, aren't you grateful?" And Europe walks by. You know what I mean?
I think that continues in a nice mix there between 1930s comedies and 40s film noir, because not merely in the novels of people like Henry James or Mark Twain or so on, but you get that the hundreds of comedies made in the 30s about the encounter between the naive American and the European
Well, it goes
nobility.
back to Henry James, really.
Sure, to Henry
you know.
James. You got Dodsworth, you got Ruggles of Red Gap, which is a reverse, where the East comes west. In this case, the West goes east. And in fact, there's a point in the film where Trevor Howard bemusedly remarks that he didn't know there were snake charmers in Texas, which brings the East to the West with a vengeance. But that comedy line is carried in the 40s films into a different kind of encounter and is moralized instead of being played for comedy and mistaken identity. And the butler who turns out to be a count, or the count who turns out to be a butler in disguise, we now find in the 40s films increasing sense that the old values of Europe are a kind of albatross on the neck of American enterprise, and normally, in those earlier films, you get a Walter Houston character who finally comes home to America and discovers real value, or ends up with his mistress in Italy in one case. But
or Dorothy coming home to Kansas.
but in any case, it's the moral, it's the fact that morality is thrown in the air and put up for grabs that I think that makes the film noir possible. In a film like The Big Heat, it's very difficult to tell who is the most intensely criminal, whether it's the cops or the crooks. And I think again and again that kind of romanticization of the criminal, which you get in the Orson Welles character in this film, is stock in trade for film noir.
Let's stick with film noir just for a second, because let's talk some more about some of the ways in which this film is visually related to film, to film noir.
Well, in all the obvious ways. First, there was rarely ever a set lighted in such obvious noirish ways. I mean, every intersection has a backlight, and every cobblestone street is shot from such an incredibly low angle so that the sheen goes clear to the horizon. The claustrophobic framing, and of course everyone remarks the constant out of kilter,
the 20 degrees,
yeah, the 20 degrees off kiltering of the frame, which really wasn't new. Duvivier did it in France in the Carnet du Bal in 1935. It had been done in Bride of Frankenstein by Whale a full 10 years before, to similar effect.
Do you know, after this film, William Wyler gave Carol Reed a present of a spirit level? He said, Carol, next time just put it on the camera. You understand? He didn't quite grasp this is a deliberate idea. I thought the camera was sort of drunk all the time.
In fact, it's the mad. I mean, all this, of course, connects to the film which opened your series, the Caligari series, going right back.
Caligarism,
the Caligarism, the use of the total disorientation of the spectatorial position, the entry into the world of madness and dream. That tilt, though, that literal tilt, I think probably has an allegorical function as well. It's a world out of kilter. It's a world where
the axis is off.
And it has a studio look, but what I love about The Third Man is precisely it's a madness with a documentary edge. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Hollywood had tried to take the camera out of the studio in a great number of noir films, and we have all kinds of films introduced by some FBI agent who says this really happened and this is the real house where the spies were caught and so forth.
Amazing Christmas.
And of course there was a documentary tradition very strong in England between the two wars, and I think that creeps in here. In fact, I'm very often reminded of Rossellini's Open City, if you're going to continue that set of connections. The outdoor shots of Venice, Vienna, excuse me, remind one, I think, a lot of Open City in some of the lighting of the streets and the openness of those places. But then into that, he puts a sense of humor. And I love Valli's line where she says, she never plays tragedy. This is a comedy, and that's reflexive as far as I'm concerned. This is a comedy, and there are about 30 moments in this film that are just inexplicable. I mean, the balloon salesman who wanders in off screen, the parrot who bites the finger. I mean, castration. Where are we? We have this Cabbage Patch Doll kid who fingers Holly and gives a throat-cutting gesture at the end. We have connections. In fact, that whole sequence reminds me of M, the little child in the ball, and the balloon man. I mean, it's clearly some kind of quotation.
Tribute,
but a lot of very unmotivated events, and the Ferris wheel, of course, itself is a set. It is the world of dream, but it's a dream that is placed specifically in history, in occupied Vienna, which tells us that the world's reality is nightmare at that point, and that the laws no longer hold.
It's interesting, you know, you look at the other major films Reed has made. We mentioned some of them, Odd Man Out, Outcast of the Islands. You know, these are all, like Third Man, about people hanging on by the fingernails. You know what I mean? They're desperados or con men or racketeers just on the edge of civilization. And it's so wonderful, I think, that Green set this in Vienna, which is we associate with European culture and empire and Gemütlich and Baroque. And here it's like, it's a pest hole. It's not the palaces and the castles that matter anymore. It's the sewer system.
It's not letter from an unknown woman. It's not.
There's no frou-frou here, you know. And it's like the ruins are almost this like a reproach as to what is going on in front of what was once Habsburg and, and great and civilization.
Well, and one of the things about this film, I mean, it comes back to its visual style, is that Reed uses so much deep focus photography in this film. So what we'll get, I think, one of the scenes in which Holly is just walking by. It's where he's actually meeting the first representative, and he's at this little cafe.
Baron Kurtz.
Baron Kurtz.
At the
And
cafe.
The violinist.
And the violinist.
With the dog.
Yeah. But the first shot we have is of people sitting there with this Viennese gentility and this wonder, having the cup of coffee. And you see that this is no gentility here. It's a bunch of little tables on, out on the sidewalk, and then we see all these bombed out buildings in the background. And
It's like a Magritte or something. What is wrong with this picture? Oh, all the buildings are gone.
And later we're told that the sewers run directly into the Blue Danube.
Yes.
Yes.
Smells sweet, doesn't it?
Yes, smells.
You mentioned Caligari, but it's interesting. It's a very good parallel. But that's a slow dream, and this is a fast one.
it's a
That's
fast
another
dream.
thing. There are no fade-outs in this film.
Yeah.
It's all cuts. And look how fast that beginning goes.
Yeah,
We are plunged
yeah.
into this world. So Joseph Cotten arrives, and in 3 minutes we know who he is, we know why he's come to Vienna, we see he's a fish out of water, and we learn a little about Harry Lime.
That
It is
montage
so
se-
fast.
That montage was added, incidentally, after the film
Right.
was made, because the fear was that the American audience would not
Where are we?
get what Vienna was all
Yes,
about in
exactly.
1945.
Well, there is also the fact, I think one of the reasons so many people are attracted to this film is not only the wit of it, the suspense, its amorality, but because of the pacing, it's an extremely rich film. I mean, once you go back and you see it again, back to my little deep focus thing, there's all kinds of things happening in the film that are pieces of business, frequently in the back part of a frame, that are, that feed into exactly what's going on in the action at that point, but are also these wonderful counterpoints. I think of Crabbit and his girlfriend,
Yes.
the lady in black who he's always kind of pushing off into the
I
back.
can't introduce you to everyone, you know.
And we see him introduce him to Noah.
Wilfred Hyde. Right. He's as much a racketeer as anyone.
Oh, no,
He's
and-
peddling literature.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. So, James Joyce. And what did you?
What do you think of him?
In the same line with Zane Grey.
Gray? What Gray? Like this indignant.
Here's a little joke.
It's like
yeah.
another lynch mob. It's a literary lynch mob.
Well,
It's
yeah.
like the one on the street.
And so there's this way in which all these moral levels, I mean, not only in the frame is everything collapsed because everything is equally corrupt in all these different levels of the frame,
Yeah.
but also all these representatives of different parts of the society. I mean, the Dr. Winkel, Dr. Winkel, the literary representative.
That's a great detail. When he goes to meet Dr. Winkel at his apartment, and we see Kurtz's dog yapping.
Oh, yeah.
That's how we know
Yeah.
Kurtz is hiding there in the background,
Yes.
and Winkel won't
Just
tell
as
him.
the cat is
Just a
used
little
earlier
bit.
to
Yes, the
identify
animals,
Harry.
Or the scene. Remember, you're talking about deep focus. Remember that
Right.
scene where they go back to Harry's apartment the first time
Yes.
after the opera, after the play, and Anna sits on his bed and quite naturally starts to brush her hair, and she answers the phone and she throws the dice. And she looks at the picture. I mean, you can see how much the man still means to her because she automatically does these things. And in the background, Martins is yammering about with the porter, when we see literally he is distant from her.
Yes.
He is not central to her life and never will be, much as he likes to think he will be. But Harry is still all for her, even though the man is not there.
And that's also the way in which the film positions us as spectators. While on the one hand we get thrown into this world with Holly Martin.
Sure.
On the other hand, we're positioned so that there's a whole set of things about this world we can potentially understand as we watch Holly Martin's not understanding or seeing any of it.
Right.
And of course, we've already been joking about Winkel, but there is this repeated motif through the film of nobody being able to remember the other person's name or the correct pronunciation.
It's a Tower of Babel they're all in. You've got 4 languages. You have 4 occupying powers. They have trouble communicating. You get the feeling everything is done in quadruplicate.
Yes.
To do anything, and it really is it's a massive incomprehension going on.
And the mistaken names lead into the mistaken person in the grave. It's Harbin in the grave,
Right,
and,
right,
and not the missing Harry Lime.
But
I like the little introductory motifs too. It's Dr. Winkel is introduced as he's carving a whole chicken. He's playing.
You get the gleam on the knife blade as
the
it
little.
pauses. And he says, Hilda, later on. And how clever, Reed is in the editing. The fact that you have Popescu, the Romanian, on the phone
Right.
saying, "Meet me at the bridge," when they're going to kill the porter.
Right.
And you see the three of them going. Winkle gets out his bicycle, and they're going to the bridge. And then he cuts to an overhead shot on the bridge, so you cannot see who the fourth person is.
And of course, since we're the kind of cinema people who keep track of famous shots in the cinema, this is a prophetic shot for one of the most famous over-the-head shots, which is the murder shot in Psycho, when Arbogast, another great film out of this expressionist tradition, when Arbogast comes up the stairway in Psycho, and the one angle where you can't tell who the killer is from
Mother.
is Mother, yes, the killer Mother.
Mother isn't herself.
Yes, the camera keeps tracking up with Arbogast, and it would naturally stop.
And then we cut overhead.
You know, and so, it continues going up overhead, and all of a sudden, the one place you can't see Mother is this
big figure coming out. Yeah.
Right, and
another parallel to Psycho is, of course, in the sewer scene. Here we are. We know what Harry Lime has done, but we are rooting for that man to escape. The cops, you know, exactly like we're rooting for that car to sink when Tony Perkins has pushed it into the swamp. You know, and it stops, and he stops chewing, and then the sinks, and we're relieved along with him, even though we have seen him just kill the woman.
Well, I mean, that gets us back to Orson Welles and his performance, because there are parallels, I think, with this and Citizen Kane.
By all means, yeah.
Because Kane, is another charismatic character whom we can never quite get. I mean, much of the point of the film is we can't get an exact beam on him, and yet there's this Orson Wellesian presence, this larger-than-lifeness that almost defies judgment. He's just this presence there.
I think it's true. Even in some parts of the film, I'm reminded of segments toward the end of Touch of Evil when he's coming down over the rubble, very similar to the just before he dies at the end of Touch of Evil, when he's coming down over the bridge and getting ready to do his back float to end the film. It's hard now, I think, for us to imagine anyone but Orson Welles playing this character, but I understand that Noel Coward was originally offered the role and turned it down, and Orson Welles has written someplace that he made an enormous mistake in accepting the role, not by accepting it because it was the first plum that had been thrown to him in a while and he needed the money. He decided, he said, to take the $100,000 that was offered instead of 10% of the gross. And this ended up one of the great blockbuster successes, particularly outside of America. Here it was a success, but it was a smash worldwide. And Wells said he could have retired permanently if he had taken the percentage.
Or made films the way he wanted to.
Exactly.
This seems to be a trend in Wells's career, because when Touch of Evil was in the planning, someone called Charlton Heston, was that what was it?
Yeah, Charlton Heston, yes.
And he said, when they had Wells for the sheriff, but they didn't know who was going to direct, he said, well, who's going to do it? And he said, well, we've got Orson Welles. And, oh, great, I'll be in anything he directs. I went, okay. So that's how we ended up directing Touch of Evil. It's called backing into things. It's wonderful. What's wonderful to me about this film, and it grows on me with time, I've always thought it was a wonderful thriller, and a great melodrama, but I think it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
I think it's about a film that absolutely smashes fantasies, and illusions, stuff that Holly Martin's and The Death of Double X Raunch lives by. I mean, it's true the villain suffers, the villains suffer ultimately, but the hero, Holly, is not rewarded, but he does not get the girl, even though when David Selznick, the American producer, saw the ending, he said, Carol, it's a wonderful film, but I don't understand. Couldn't they kiss? Couldn't they get together? I mean, I don't understand what's going on. Why does she go by? And Carol said, that's sort of the idea.
Maybe the main point.
We're passing by, But all of Holly's good intentions, mess everything up.
Absolutely.
It's like the blundering, the ugly American. He really is.
In fact, the double X, I don't think it's misplaced to speak of double cross, which is, I think, the central motif of the film. Right. And of course, the double X and the death of these ideals, I think, take us back to a theme that we haven't maybe stressed enough, and that's the way in which this film is really gunfight at the OK Corral in a Vienna cafe. I mean, it's the Oklahoma Kid, which is used as a pointer and as an identifier and so forth, is actually the name of a film that was made around 1930 and that starred both Cagney and Bogart in early roles. And the rest of the film sort of plays with all the conventions of precisely that naive, innocent American abroad, that Holly Martins is and proves himself to be in the literary discussion and elsewhere. Right. He is a Westerner. And we have a fist fight, which is subverted by being a one-punch blow by Sergeant Payne. It's a very quick fight.
Right.
There's a shootout at the end where, you know, two old friends, one ends up administering the coup de grace to the other.
Right.
There's an admonition to get out of town and not before sunset, but on the plane tomorrow. And of course, Holly himself is quite aware of the fact that he's playing out a Western motif because he says he's gunning for Callahan, in quotes, in the same way that his heroes gun for. And he speaks about, he's not sure whether he likes cops, but he always has to call them sheriffs in his work.
And he's the honest man who's come to clean up the
clean
town.
up, yes,
town place Vienna.
Yeah, it's just very much the Western. And when we see, when that Western motif gets put into the Ferris wheel, then we have a weird, a double shift. First, he shifts from being a Western hero to being a private eye.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, he says, I'm now writing detective mystery. It's going to be called The Third Man. Another nice reflexive touch to go with all the other points where we are placed in movie theaters or have slideshows there, where the rhinoceros is the first slide or whatever. But then he's put into a position so that he's that the Western motif switches to the private eye, and the private eye then becomes metaphysical. And at the top of that Ferris wheel, we got finally a kind of apotheosis of a reverse God. You spoke of Satan. Here we have the notion that God's view of the world would be one precisely in which he could not care if a dot stops moving. He says, what does it matter to me if one of those dots stop moving? Is it worth $20,000?
And yet it's light. It's lightly handled. It's in an amusement park.
In fact, it's one of the few funny film noirs. I think of, you know, Dick Powell's, say, in Murder My Sweet, where there are an awful lot of one-liners that come from the original novel. But usually they weren't a lot of fun. And this one is full of jokes.
Doesn't take itself seriously.
But there's this wonderful way in which corruption, paranoia, and comedy all coexist in this world. And that makes it all. I mean, that makes it all the more confounding to a guy like Holly Martins. He can't figure this out at all.
That's what I mentioned before. The idea of a melodrama that subverts its own genre. You know what I mean? That it goes beyond itself. I mean, by one standard, Lime deserves to die, but by another, Love, he is terribly missed. You know what I mean? This is a film that leaves melodrama and becomes a film about moral variables. I think, you know, that there is more than black and white in the world, and Holly Martins will never understand that.
I think even for anyone who has seen this charismatic character, you kind of go, well, yeah, he kills children, but he's a kind of fun guy.
We don't see him doing it again.
We don't see him, and you kind of say, well, wait a minute, what we get left with is Joseph Cotton.
Yes, right. What a treat.
What a treat.
Alida Valli deserves better.
Yeah, very much the stuff. Now this is a film, you know, that has had an influence on later people as well, because I think of the most famous reference to this film is at the end of Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah, in which things get even more kind of baroquely self-reflexive. Not necessarily better.
That's going for Baroque.
Yeah.
I think that last shot is again, a reverse parody of the Western ending. It's usually the man who rides off on a horse into the sunset. And here we have a woman who walks toward the camera and keeps walking right past, and thus completing the reversal that's been in the rest of the film, and giving a parody and a theology simultaneously.
As the dead leaves fall.
In fact, I think we're onto something interesting here. My guess is that this film is in for a certain kind of reevaluation in its kind of postmodernist terms. I mean, it does subvert itself in a lot of interesting ways, both from the standpoint of its moral commitments and also from the intrusion, the insertion of all these little visual bits of business, so that you don't get this straightforward linear film with closure. If you pull away from the visuals and you pull away from the details, then you have a very standard story. But you look just beneath the surface morally and just at the surface visually, and you have a film which disperses itself in a way that I think most of the critics at that time would have thought rather decadent.
Well, in fact,
paying attention to detail instead of structure. You know?
It's interesting because in Andrew Sarris's very, very important book, The American Cinema, in which since Reed worked in a Hollywood studio style in so many ways, he includes Reed was initially considered in the category less than meets the eye, and that seems with all due respect to Mr. Sayers, exactly wrong these days.
Do we have to give all due respect to him?
No.
That's another show. Isn't
Okay,
it?
that's another. No, but it seems so. It seems that the film is so rich in exactly these ways that, I mean, you're talking about the ways in which all the visual detail and these all these motifs seem to molest the linear narrative and open it up in all kinds of ways.
Well, Reed was known especially for his lack of insistence as a director, and that would have put him outside the pale of the auteurist understanding of the director's job. He did not impress his personality on the film. If there is a personality here, it's
Very self-effacing
certainly
man.
Yes,
Harry Lime's. I mean, it's Orson Welles' personality that stamps itself, I suppose. And clearly you can see from films that Reed made much later, in films like Oliver or whatever, which are so different in tone and style, that he was a technician. He was a person who loved to do massively beautiful things with the material as it was presented.
Right.
And I think maybe that's the reason.
David Lean, it's somewhat the
and
same
David Lean.
tradition. But respect for the actors. He always gave the
respect
actors their head,
and for the
which is great.
materials that he was given. Well, we end on a note of respect.
That's
for,
it?
For how did that ever happen?
And now the second half hour of the film.
Okay, if you'd like more information about this series, Cinema Then, Cinema Now, or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate at the College of Staten Island, please drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that information again, okay? Write to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301.
Or call Jerry at home.
Oh, yeah, Steve. Okay, and we'll give him your number.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, Steve, thanks for coming on the show. Daryl, always a pleasure having another CUNY faculty member along with us. And I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us. Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today, we continue our 5-part mini-series on the new Hungarian cinema, surveying one of the most dynamic national cinemas in the world. We'll be seeing Marta Mészáros' The Girl from 1968. The moving account of a young woman's search for her lost parents, it's also a brilliant critique of how patriarchy works in modern industrial societies. I hope you enjoy The Girl. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed Marta Mészáros' The Girl. I'd like to take this moment to introduce the two guests I have today, and then we'll launch into our discussion of this, I think, fascinating film. To my left, I have the pleasure today of having Amy Taubin. Amy is the film and video curator at the Kitchen. She's also recently produced and directed 12 shows which are based on works that have been shown or sponsored by the kitchen. Those 12 shows are called the Kitchen Screen and have been screened on CUNY TV. She's also a regular writer on film and television for the Village Voice, and sometime in that very busy schedule, she also has time to be a film and video maker herself. Sitting to my right is Professor Yvette Borough. Yvette is the author of numerous articles and books translated into a number of languages. Her most recent work, book-length work to be translated into English, is Profane Mythology, The Savage Mind of the Cinema, published by Indiana University Press. Yvette spends her time as a professor in the Graduate School of Film at NYU, where she teaches screenwriting and other things. Well, no, a woman of general culture, as they say. Yvette, I thought I'd start with you. You have an obvious credential with regard to this film. You are Hungarian and were working in the Hungarian film industry at the time this film was made. Could you set the context of this film for us? What was Marta Mészáros doing before this film, and what was this moment in filmmaking, if it is such a thing, like the late 60s in Hungary? Our audience last week had the pleasure of seeing István Szabó's Father, film that precedes this one by 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, just to start with, it is a first feature film, a first fiction film, which means that it is a very decisive moment in the life of and in the career of Marta Mészáros. But also, as you said, it was a very important period of Hungarian filmmaking. 60s, late 60s, mid 60s, something new started. As to her career, she has a long career of document filmmaking, which means it's a very special terrain, a very special activity in Hungarian film production. It's many times it's considered by authorities as something secondary, which gives the chance for many people really to experiment and to start and to make quite important films, because I would say there was less control over there. And in that sense also Marta had this chance to somehow really to prepare her work to become as I think really original and very personal as it seems to be in this film. She has made almost, I don't know, more than a dozen of quite important documentaries dealing with very specific topics, close to this one, which means that working girls, factory, this kind of very bleak and sometimes very deprived universe of everyday life, and always, if possible, focusing on female characters, because it was obviously her main concern.
Okay. Now, how did she make the move from documentary to feature film, and how would that happen?
It was not an easy way, I must tell you. Okay. She has waited maybe almost 15 years to be able to produce her first fiction film. It was not her first screenplay. She has written some fiction screenplays before. I knew them and they were quite interesting, but none of them has been that personal and therefore maybe that powerful as this one we have seen. It was before. And I think she had to fight and to convince people, authorities, also colleagues, that she would be able to direct a fiction film, which means dealing with actors she has never done before. And therefore it was quite daring that she has started to have an actress who was not an actress, because the leading character is actually not an actress.
She was a pop star? She was a pop star.
Yeah, she was a pop star, and but interestingly enough, I mean, her whole background and life history was very close, actually, to the story of this character.
Okay, now, Amy, you like me are not Hungarian and we're not there. However, you've, like many people interested in film, you've followed Marta Mészáros as the works have become available to us, as they've been distributed, or as you found them at festivals. What kind of relations do you find between this, a first work, and some of the things that you've seen that you've seen since?
The reason that I followed Marta Mészáros is obviously that I think she's a very important feminist filmmaker.
Right.
And that her films for me have always had, how do you say, they're narrative films. They're not conventional narrative films, but they are basically realist narrative films. And it seemed to me that within that position,
Right.
A feature film narrative director, not a person who was working within an avant-garde context, that her films seemed to me to be to present women in a way that I hadn't seen before. And the first film of hers that I saw was Women, and then I saw 9 Months. And when I looked at this film, actually, about 2 hours ago, for the first time, I was very surprised, and I actually think that of the films I've seen, except for the most recent, the Diary film, this is her most powerful film. And it also seems to me to be, in certain ways, formally, very different than the later films, and that's the issue that has to do with camera movement, and the expressivity of the camera movement in this film seems to me to be very different than the later films.
Yeah. May I add to it something? Just she would never accept the notion that feminist filmmaker. She has given many interviews, and she always refused this very label, saying that she doesn't want to be restricted to this very particular group of filmmakers, because she used to say that films, if they are interesting, they have to be more universal. I'm just saying that because I know that she would really refuse it.
And so would Chantal Akerman, and so would Margareta Contrada, and so would a lot of people refuse it.
Right.
Yeah, which doesn't mean, obviously, that we cannot find a terrible consistency in all her films, as you said, and they always have this very, very strong and determined female characters who reflect a very particular position. It's out of question.
Yeah. Well, what did you find, Amy, about the camera movement? I mean, when the three of us were chatting before the show, it's a film that draws attention to its camera movements in a number of ways.
I mean, the camera movement is it's obvious in the film. I mean, and it's obvious in the sense that traditionally camera movement is, in conventional films, it's matched to the movement of the subject within the frame, or it's there to describe a space very clearly. This camera movement is one noticeable in and of itself, because it's usually a moving camera on stationary figures. The place that it's really ravishing is in the final, in that lunch, that peculiar lunch he has with the man who is conning her into buying him a lot of cognac. And there's just a ton of camera movement around that table, and it has this incredibly restless quality, which is really emotive. I mean, it's expressive of the psychological, emotional state of this character. But it's something that's also beyond that. So it has a kind of formal distancing effect, and at the same time, it's very kinetic, and you do relate it to a depiction of character. I think what's different in this film than the other films is, the thing that makes her a wonderful dramatic filmmaker is that she's able to describe dramatic situations through the depiction of space, and how characters are, how near or far they are, or how they move an arm in relation to one another. But the space is much less fluid in the later films, and it's more the characters moving to and fro. And the whole space is made dynamic by that camera movement.
And you know about the work on this film and the camera
Yeah.
because this is a cinematographer who had worked also with Miklos Jancho on the Roundup.
The Roundup and the Red and the White.
Right, which
and
are
I mean, he is a very particular cinematographer or film camera person because he has exactly two wonderful qualities, and those are related to those qualities you have mentioned. First of all, a terrible sense of composition, which was deliberately focused on a geometrical way of putting background and moving characters somehow in a very dynamic way together. On the other hand, which was basically the influence in the 60s, the influence of also Antonioni, but also of the French New Wave, to have a kind of open structure. The open structure in the sense that you have an always moving, very dynamic camera, but still having the sense of composition, which is seemingly contradictory, but for that reason it's very rare to have a good balance between those two different features. And this man had this wonderful talent and also had the tradition by working with Miklos Jancho exactly to explore the power of space, and on the other hand having this very interesting framing compositional quality which is so nice in this film. But also I think that in this film camera movement is basically related to the openness of the narrative structure in this film, which was very unusual and not very well received in this very moment.
Let's just stop. I'd love to go on and talk about its dramatic structure, but let's just stop and talk about the reception not only of this film but of this outburst of creativity in Hungarian film at this point. Just to make the point again, last week our audience, I hope if they were lucky enough to tune in, had seen Szabo's Father, which relates in certain ways to what you've just said, because there's a lot of moving camera in that film. There's the moment, for example, of the father's funeral at the very beginning of the film, and the camera is circling around people there. So while these two films are extremely different in dramatic structure and the purposes, the particular uses of a moving camera, nonetheless they share the same general aesthetic. But back to, these films, for lack of a better word, they're experimental narrative films. I don't like the phrase, but they are. How were they received? I mean,
the most important question, I think, is to understand that mid-60s, those were the years of the first, I would say, personal filmmaking, auteur films, which meant that people dared to be confessional, personal, talking really in a very immediate, dramatic way about their own experiences. And therefore, this authenticity had a great impact on people because, well, official filmmaking is always, as you might know, quite, heavy-handed, conventional, and obviously somehow impersonal. And for that reason, I wouldn't say that it was a, box office. It was not. Obviously, this is an enormous hit, but people were very, very deeply impressed. And it was the beginning of something extremely important and well discussed, let's say. Not popular, I don't know what the word means, but somehow exciting and considered as such.
Amy, I just use this phrase I'm not happy with, experimental narrative, and a narrative film, or something that goes against the grain of how narrative is constructed, that remains narrative, but goes against the common grain of how narrative is constructed. Does that impress you about this film?
Yes and no. I mean, I think compared to a very conventional film, I mean, obviously this is a narrative which is somewhat open. It's a young girl goes on a journey and she meets a number of people and she's on a quest. Right. And at the end, she's found some sort of answer which is dealt with in a kind of ambiguous way in the film. And one of the things I was interested in was how, this is slightly off, we could come back to it later, the picture she arrives at about who her parents were is a very different picture than we get in the later Mészáros film. nevertheless, it's a fairly realistic narrative. You know, it's character description, it's full character description of a number of characters. I think what interested me enormously was the depiction of sexuality, and the depiction of sexuality from a woman's point of view, and that had to do with a very critical, her very critical and detached, the characters now, a relationship to how the men treated her, and particularly that very funny scene of the television watching. And then that extraordinary scene of her prowling into the bedroom and watching what is not the primal scene, but watching this woman who's a mother in bed with this man who's not her father. I mean, that's really quite extraordinary. And it's that emphasis in the narrative that I think probably was somewhat unusual, that interests me.
You are talking about the psychology, and I agree with you that this was unusual in the courage or in the sincerity, in the way as she has portrayed this girl. But also I think what was in the narrative and in the whole composition somehow so unusual, the fragmented character of the whole story, because she never enters into a very heavy-handed and direct explanation or motivation. She just follows the most important, somehow the surface of the events, but those are chosen or selected in such a harsh and powerful way that you have to put together out of those details what is exactly happening inside or behind. And this was very unusual. People were not really ready or open, at least in Hungary, to understand exactly. They got it, they got the sense, the real meaning of it, but they didn't get what they were maybe expecting, this kind of very direct motivational explanation, why the next step would happen, why is she going further in order to meet with this man, why is she going to accept the invitation of this unknown person, and to go immediately to bed. And you have to make a spectator really somehow to put together all the motives and reasons to it. And I think this kind of fragmented element of the whole story and this kind of elusive character is extremely modern today, and this is maybe the reason that it works so well after 20 years.
I think also, we'd mentioned Michelangelo Antonioni, and a number of the things that you've been saying, while I do not want to suggest at all that Marta Mészáros is imitative, because there's a distinct quality to her work, but there are nonetheless distinct parallels with what Antonioni is doing in a far more famous film than this one, though I hope that our show brings this film to the attention of people who admire something like Antonioni's L'Avventura, which has a journey structure, which has a quest, a search, and which, like this film, shifts the attention to the particular set of motives of people, but large gaps are left out, so we must fill in those sets of motivations. And I think the two works run a very, very nice parallel with one another in narrative.
I couldn't disagree more.
You couldn't disagree?
I couldn't disagree more. No, I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen the Antonioni film, but it seems to me that the Antonioni film wants to be enigmatic, and that this film doesn't want to be enigmatic at all. And for me, was not the least bit enigmatic. I mean, I understood exactly what was happening to that person, and she actually sets it up very nicely. I mean, she says in the first words that woman says in the film is, "I feel terrible," you know? And then you know that this is going to be a film about the working out of a situation in which a person feels terrible and goes on and acts. I mean, she actually tries to find out, she actually tries to do something that will make herself feel better.
Right.
But all her actions are explained out of that. And it's a very, the film in that sense is it's quite subjective, and the identification is quite singular, unlike later Mészáros films where there are usually two women and the identification goes back and forth. Even though the mother gets to be important for a while, the identification is very singular. In Antonioni, there's no point of identification like that. You're looking at these people making patterns from the outside. They don't quite meet. And that's the point. You're not meant to understand.
Oh, okay, I don't think we can go on with this because we clearly disagree about Antonioni and L'Avventura, because I don't think it's supposed to be mysterious. I think it's very precise social criticism. But you were about to say something.
Yeah, no, but I want to add, also I don't believe that it was directly Antonioni, but if she was under the influence of someone or something, it was much more the late Godard film, Vivre sa vie, I don't know what's the English title to it. Yeah.
My Life to Live.
My Life to Live, yeah, with Anna Karina, and also somehow, I mean, the look of Kati Kovács is deliberately a little bit similar. I mean, it was under this spell of this wonderful film, and when I'm talking about fragmentation and about those very clearly composed vignettes and episodes, which are deliberately not somehow glued together with a kind of transition, which would be really boring. And this gives to this film an enormous density, and somehow this kind of very, I call it bleakness, which corresponds so wonderfully to the subject, to the real topic. It is not decorative, it is not over-dramatized, on the contrary. But it doesn't mean that there is a detachment. On the contrary, you are right, it is a very deep identification. But since the character is exactly this kind of character of strong and decision and a kind of sorrow, which is in the very middle of the center of her whole life, I think this explains this very particular treatment of the story.
Yeah. I mean, that particular Godard occurred to me too, right from the beginning, because you have that sequence of stills of the actress, and she does look, you know, is costumed like that. The thing that's so different is that in My Life to Live, that woman is victim. I mean, that woman is a total victim, and she's very passive in relation to what happens to her. And this woman is, although she's acting from a defensive position, you never have the sense of her being victimized. I mean, you always have the sense of her living deliberately counter to authority, and that she chooses to go off with these men, and that they all hit on her basically because she has no interest in them, or she has very little interest in them, and that makes her very intriguing to them. And then, you know, she's the person who leaves in the morning. No one leaves her.
Yeah, but when I mentioned this word bleakness, there is a solitude around this girl, although at the ending she finds a man, she has chosen again someone, but we are not convinced that there is any kind of happy ending or happiness waiting for her. And this was something very rebellious also in the attitude of Marta Mészáros, because, you know, again, socialist, realistic film, so they are much more optimistic, and they have never talked about this universal question of being in a big city, a working girl, and being so much isolated and in such a terrible solitude. And this ambience is extremely strong in the film.
Oh. And one of the interesting things about the film is that there's, to my mind, is that there is this initial separation and difference of the city and the farm, in the farm community. I mean, they seem to look different. We have the scenes in the textile mill versus the scenes in the agrarian community. And we have, you know, the urban kinds of men, you use Amy's phrase, hitting on her on the train, that sort of thing. Yet, what the film chronicles in a way is a terrible continuity within the culture.
This is also interesting because we know many times, and particularly in our culture, there existed a kind of confrontation between urban life and country life, and country life was always idealized as something beautiful, untouched. You have nature, you have birds, and so on. And she again had the courage to bring it to the same level, and whatever scenes we have in this small village, they exactly radiate those scenes, the same solitude and bleakness and sadness, which was very unusual. critical because.
Well, we come back to camera movement, I think, because one of the things that's most striking about, I think, of the scene in which the character goes out and there are the young men in the village who are standing around, and of course, you know, the actual foliage itself is beautiful and lush and pretty, yet the way in which the camera composes the scene, the way in which they stand in relationship to one another, and that amazingly clipped dialogue. So, you're from Budapest.
Yeah.
And we understand how much, you know, loneliness, alienation, how much friction there is between the sets of gender roles, overthrowing all of the possibilities of the camera visually describing this wonderful, bucolic farming community.
But I think, yeah, what we get out of it is again emptiness, solitude, a feeling of repression, and if you want, this was really political in the simplest sense, and therefore again, it was an enormous achievement and courage to put it together in this way.
Yeah. Amy, you were talking a little bit earlier about Mészáros as a feminist filmmaker, and we mentioned some other names, people who may even themselves deny that kind of label, but who are part of this increasingly important, increasingly recognized body of women making feature films. How would
we hope they're increasing, but it's
not.
No, I mean it's really not.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I think the moment may have, for the time being, passed actually, and it's getting more and more difficult. It's you know, who else is there?
Well, who else is there, and how do you see them in some relation to?
It's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about this recently because I was thinking a lot about Margareta von Trotta.
Right.
And one of the things that unites European women feature film director is this impulse toward the autobiographical, which you find in Mészáros very obviously, in Von Trotta less obviously, but then when you begin to talk to her, you realize that it's there quite strongly. In Duras, in Chantal Akerman, and in Helga Sander. There are a number of women, and their work is it's across a spectrum that some may seem more toward the avant-garde and some may seem more conventional, but what pulls them all together is this way that they have of working narrative in relation to autobiography.
I have to throw in that strikes me as characteristic of some of the writings as well, because Margaret Duras novels, many of them play upon that sort of thing, and someone like the East German novelist Christa Wolf very much works.
Who is now working with Margareta von Trotta on a project.
Oh, is that?
Yeah.
Well, that sounds very. That sounds exciting. Yvette, Marta Mészáros is not the only woman feature filmmaker in Hungary. I mean, proportionately, as a national cinema, the Hungarians seem to have a higher percentage of women. Who are some of the other people who we really don't see here?
There is one quite important and successful, her name is Judith Eleke, and she has also made many documentaries and some features which are also somehow between documentary and fiction. And she was quite known, she is quite known in France and Italy maybe, but unfortunately not here.
Yeah. So what's happened? I mean, this film is '68. We're going to be seeing another Mészáros film in this series, Adoption 75, and I think many of our viewers may have had a chance, or they might have a chance to see a recent film, Diary for My Children, which was in release in the United States in '85, I think, and is now on the...
It was at the New York Film Festival maybe 2 years ago, yeah, and she won many prizes with it because it was really the most personal film. It was a film she has prepared for many, many years. She couldn't get authorization for it because the topic was too much delicate politically. And then when the film was made, then it was banned actually for 2 years, and so it had a long and very tormented story itself.
Yeah. Well, it's I saw it in fact at the festival. Then it opened in New York commercially. Didn't stay all that long. I'm very sorry to say, but it's available for rental and is I think quite quite an interesting film on any ground. I mean, it's certainly in contrast to this one because we see her formal development. I mean, telling a different kind of story, she uses very different kinds of story, of story means. Well, you know, on this note, I think, of how Marta Mészáros continues to make interesting films, we come to the end of the show, though I want to counsel everybody that Marta Mészáros will return in this series in several weeks with her second film, Adoption. If you'd like more information about this series, Cinema Then, Cinema Now, or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate at the College of Staten Island, drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that information again, okay? That's Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, Amy, thanks for taking time from your busy schedule to come in and bring your expertise about feminism, film, and so many other things. Yvette, our resident Hungarian expert on so many things, and brilliant film theorist, thanks for showing up as well for your second appearance on this. Well, I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us.